Welcome back. We're here again with Rebbe from Chicago. And today I wanted to discuss an interesting topic that has been in this in the last couple of days. This is based on an article and a podcast done by the Herr. I just want to clarify, we're not here as a rebuttal, or we're not here to start a debate or machlekes. It was a topic that the topic they've written about is about Yiddish and Chabad. This is a topic that I have thought about and think about a lot, and feel like I have a lot to say. And they definitely, in the article and in their podcast, definitely discussed it relatively comprehensively in a certain way, but I still think there's more to add, more context to give. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to, while the conversation's going, while the debate is going, to weigh in and give my 2 cents. But of course, respectfully, that they wrote about it and brought up the topic and did the research that they did, and it's definitely informative in its own right.
I should confess that I have not yet read the article nor listened to that podcast, so I'll just put that out there.
Right. I'm sure that between the two of us, we represent our listenership, who I'm sure some of whom did hear and some of whom didn't. So essentially, this is either a standalone, I think this is served both as a standalone discussion and as not a response per se, but we're it's part of the discourse, part of the discussion around the topic. By way of a short akdam, I do want to offer a subtle critique, again, not a rebuttal or anything like that. But approaching a topic like this, a sensitive topic, it's not crazy sensitive, but still a relatively sensitive topic that's negated to a lot of people's decisions as parents. Most decisions regarding chinuch, it's an important issue. So I just want to be aware that as one goes to yeshiva and then grows up, at least speaking for myself, I remember when I was younger, there was sometimes this illusion that if you're malakit, you make a search, find the Sefer Likutim, you can make a search through the sichos and the igros. There's sort of this illusion that if you're malakit enough sichos and enough igros, maybe a few more anecdotes that are harder to find. Sometimes there's this illusion that that's enough to sort of tell you what the Rebbe Shita is. Often this comes from I don't think kanoish is the right term, but if you're, the term Chabad sometimes say is spitz. None of these terms are particularly accurate and relevant, but I mean, there's this idea where you assume that the more conservative or the more extreme choice in the situation is probably the more correct one. And if you're malakit enough things where the Rebbe seems to be expressing that conservatism, in this example, if you're malakit enough things where the Rebbe seems to be saying you should speak Yiddish, should be using Yiddish, so that sort of creates enough of there's a term an expression I'm looking for here, critical mass. It reaches critical mass, and so then you're able to. I'm saying that once you hit a certain amount of sources, you feel like your argument is compelling enough, and then you can sort of lord it over other people. And what you're doing is not correct. The Rebbe says this. The Rebbe holds that. To the credit of the article and the podcast, it seems like sort of coming from that direction, maybe, where maybe that was the initial, that was the ratzoi, and then there's a ratzoi, and there's a shuv, where the shuv is, well, actually, there's more nuance, it's more complex. There are actually the reality. Sometimes the mekayros on the record are stronger, but the reality in many communities of how things actually worked out in reality, maybe sometimes is the counter argument to prove that things are not so two-dimensional. In general, I would use the term two-dimensional versus three-dimensional, where often a bunch of sources gives you a two-dimensional picture, but in order to really understand where we're coming from, how things developed, why things are the way they are, you need to have a more three-dimensional understanding of history. And I think in this case as well, the discussion often just turns into the Rebbe said this, the Rebbe said that. But let's zoom out a bit. What is Yiddish, and why do Jews speak Yiddish, and why did the Rebbeim speak Yiddish, and what would be the argument to speak Yiddish, and what would be the argument not to speak Yiddish? If you sort of zoom out and have a larger Havana, a larger understanding of the Indian, then you can actually appreciate what the Rebbe is saying and how the Rebbe is saying it and there's more context, and it can make more sense, as opposed to just sometimes in discussions in our community, it turns into, how many sources can I line up for my argument? Like I said, if I find 5 sources, find 10 sources, and it reaches critical mass, then you can't argue with me. I have enough sources to prove to make my case. As opposed to things are, especially as we see in this case, it clearly was more nuanced than just even if the Rebbe said 10 times to people, why are you not speaking Yiddish? That's still not enough to give you the full picture. And again, I think they did do a fairly good job of presenting that nuance, of demonstrating that it's not black and white. But there's definitely more room, I think, to present things from a different perspective. So that's where I hope to step in and to have something to offer.
All right.
So I would like
So let's
to
talk about what the origins of Yiddish are.
Right. So I'd like to start by zooming out and briefly, maybe this could be a longer episode for another occasion to talk about Barichus. We are limited in time, so we'll try to keep it to around an hour. But at least for Kitzer, to have an understanding of Yiddish, because I think a lot of us, or most of us, or even most from people, even those that speak Yiddish, don't really have a clear idea, clear understanding of what Yiddish is, where Yiddish comes from, etc. So the history of Yiddish is about 1,000 years old, and that itself is apparently a chiddush to many people. I know some of my own friends from yeshiva, touch with. More than one of them recently expressed to me that they were surprised to learn that Yiddish is many hundreds of years old. They thought it was 200-300 years old at best, and could be there's a good reason for that. Everything I said last time, everything has a kernel of emes. So if they have that impression, there must be a reason for that impression. And our history, our conception of history, generally I think only goes back 200-300 years, especially within Chabad. Maybe in the Chassidus world, for some people the history goes back further. If you're aware of the yichus, if you're misyachas to gedolim like the shach and the taz, maybe your concept of history goes a little further back. But our sort of our recent history doesn't really go back further than 200-300 years. And also Yiddish has changed and evolved. So much of the Yiddish that we are familiar with is probably no older than 200-300 years old, but really Yiddish is about 1,000 years old, and this goes back to the origins of I don't know if modern is the right word, but when we talk about the Jewish world, Jewish practice, Jewish minhagim, all of that is about 1,000 years old, and very, very briefly, we know that up until 1,000 years ago, there were yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael, yeshivas in Bavel. Those were the centers of Torah in the world. And there were Jews in other places. There was a diaspora, but there were no independent centers of Jewish learning. Obviously, I'm simplifying, greatly simplifying things, but to collapse it, you could, I don't want to come across as being, oversimplifying and, just making statements up that really require a lot more nuance. But for the time that we have, we're going to simplify and say that there were no real Torah centers until 1,000, 1,100. Again, we're not being medayik akadekach, but there was no famous community with rabbanim and yeshivas and rashi yeshivas anywhere else in the world besides Eretz Yisrael and Bavel till around 1,000 years ago. And around the time that Eretz Yisrael was already declining for longer, but by the time Bavel started declining, around that time we suddenly find a bunch of Torah centers springing up in a variety of places, particularly in a variety of places in Europe. And Ashkenaz, Germany, is one of those places. And what we find is that until then, I don't know if we can say with certainty what the Jews in every diaspora spoke at any point before 1,000 years ago, but we know that Bisman, the end of Bayis Rishon, throughout Bayis Sheni, and even afterwards, Aramaic was obviously a major language, was sort of the international language from the end of Bayis Rishon through much of Bayis Sheni, which is its own fascinating topic. But Aramaic was a Jewish language. It comes up in this conversation. It was mentioned that Rebbe compared Yiddish to Aramaic in a certain sense. So Aramaic is a very important Jewish language for that period of time. And obviously the Gemara is written in a dialect of Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, etc. And then we know that once the Muslims came to power, it seems like Arabic mostly replaced Aramaic in Bavel and places like that in that part of the world. And ever since then, Judeo-Arabic becomes a very important Jewish language. the Rambam, the Rambam, and many others wrote their important works in dialect or variant or whatever term is the most
Right.
appropriate.
Even though they
Their Arabic.
still remained, even in, for example, just coming to mind stuff from the Siddur of Reb Sadi Goin, that there's still lines in there in Aramaic, which is interesting. In other words, even though by the point of saying something in Aramaic was that it's in the local tongue, but even though once they switched to Arabic, it was still, and even we still say, Kol Chamira and things like that, which are supposed to be, this actually pertains to our Yiddish conversation, but when you invite to Zimun, so in the Gemara it says Havlon v'Nivrich, so we say, okay, we're going to say it in our language, which is Yiddish. So we say Rabbi Samevel and Benchen, but by that logic, maybe we should be saying it in English, or at least in some places they should be saying it in English nowadays. But it's interesting how there's certain things which are not said in Lashon HaKodesh because they're supposed to be said in the language the colloquial language, and then that changes, but we're stuck with saying things in Aramaic or.
Right. So that itself is an interesting snapshot. You find a bunch of places where text is frozen in Aramaic, like you say, clearly for that reason. There's more in that. There's Heilach Ma'an Yon Haggadah. There's the nusach for the Erevin, Erev Tavshilin, etc. And a bunch of other things in the Siddur that are still in Aramaic.
Sadigon has Shir, I think, some parts of it in Aramaic.
Right. Like you say, and then you have an example in the Siddur where there's the Yiddish, very interesting example of that. And like you say, the question is, we'll get to towards the end about the matzah we are in today, where I think even the most modern Orthodox, or even the most Israeli of Israeli, they still have Yiddish words and phrases that they still know. So it's not like we have to go with bir chametz. It's been the eradication of Yiddish has been pretty radical enough. We don't have to eradicate other vestiges. So I'm not agreeing that we have to replace Rabbi Samevel mentioned. Also, I was recently somewhere where someone jokingly wanted to translate it into English, and they translated it as "we want to bench." And I said that's I think that's incorrect. Felon in this context means we will, and the will in the sense of going to and will in the sense of want to are etymologically related, and that's why you might confuse felon and villain. But so it's actually interesting.
So you found we spoke. There was a sikh from the Frierdiker Rebbe where the Frierdiker Rebbe mentions that in the Hakdama to Manishtana, there's taka tunis chois, whether it's tatech vel badir fragen or tatech vil badir fragen, and
right.
Anyway, but that's.
Right, so it's interesting. It also revolves around that. So I don't know if my anecdote proves that we should abandon Yiddish because clearly the person translating it thought it meant one thing and it meant something else, or Adarab, it's a proof that we shouldn't use English because then
it's definitely a proof that we shouldn't use Aramaic because I think in the new, what's called the annotated Chassidus, whoever made that editorial decision, I'm fairly certain they removed Havlon v'Nivrich from the page. So.
Interesting. I mean, if it's an Alter Rebbe Siddur, then why is it being removed? I don't know. Okay. Sure, we don't have time to get off into all the tangents that we like to get into. So back to the history. So somewhere around 1,000 years ago, as these new communities spring up and they're more fully independent from Babel, from these centers, we find that they all seems more or less simultaneously. Again, this is just a Kitzer Nimrod, so we're not making accurate articulations of exactly what happened. But it seems like they all more or less spontaneously sprung up, and they all sprung up more or less speaking the local language of the lands they were in. So again, I think I was talking about Arabic. So we know that in Babel, places like that, Judeo-Arabic replaced Aramaic as the spoken language, even as the written language for new chiburim that were written in the tongue that the others could understand. And we'll get to this point, how some of these spoken languages are seen as sort of inferior. They're not seen as the language, the register in which scholars write. And we know that Yiddish had this status, and that's part of what makes Chabad's relationship with Yiddish very interesting, and that Chabad actually uses Yiddish a lot more, even in the Chassidus world, very interestingly. And it gets to this point that they were talking about Hafatzas Hamayanis, and that Hafatzas Hamayanis 75 years ago may have meant using Yiddish more than the average, and today Hafatzas Hamayanis means using English more than other Chassidish communities. But whatever the factors are, Yiddish, for example, historically was not considered a respectable language for scholarship. Aramaic clearly was a respectable language for scholarship. Judeo-Arabic was clearly also for the first few hundred years, a respectable language for scholarship, and then it stops being a respectable language for scholarship. Judeo-Arabic had its own internal history. Those that are super into that sort of know that there was sort of this intellectual Arabic world, and the Jewish intellectuals were sort of mimicking, copying, riffing off of that Arabic intellectual world, and they were also writing in this register, this very high register of Judeo-Arabic, and then as the Arabs stopped writing in that style, the Jews stopped writing in this style, and the later Arabic-speaking Jews themselves couldn't even really understand the older Judeo-Arabic texts. That's why there's been this whole renaissance in the last 100 years of Kapach and then many others sort of returning to those medieval Judeo-Arabic texts. So that's its own fascinating history.
I want to give a quick
important.
Maramakum for people who are interested in that topic. Two recent things come to mind. One is an article in the Mesivos, which is just one volume so far. And also they recently published from Alizais the Pirush Rasag on Sefer Vayikra, and in the Movoy or the Hakdama, he has a whole shtickle about the history or the development of Judeo-Arabic.
Right, so this it's the same circle of people that are kochen zich, to use a Yiddish term, that are kochen zich in Judeo-Arabic, that put out this Chavitz Mesivos, which is sort of trying to create a renaissance and bring back those texts and bring back those ideas, and then the Rasag, working on the Rasag Goin's translation and commentary on the Torah, is sort of part of that larger project. So I don't know how many people are aware of this movement and of this project, but in the Haredi world, even among some of them are Ashkenazi, they're not even all Sephardim, but or I don't know if Sephardim is even the right term, or those of Judeo-Arabic ancestry, but there is this interest, like I said, it started with Kapach, you could say, in the last 100 years, but there are those that are continuing that work in that project. But that's its own whole subject. But just to broaden our horizons, and even the Rebbe, I think in that sikha about the Yiddish, Tanya, the radio, I don't remember if now if the Rebbe mentions, but the Rebbe sort of mentions there are other Judeo languages. This Yiddish fits into a larger map of Judeo languages, and in order to have an intelligent discussion about it, we do have to zoom out. Another language with Ran Chazal that I should mention is Greek. There was clearly a Judeo-Greek. We know that at certain points in Chazal talk about Greek as being a language where you might even be able to write the Sefer Torah in Greek. You might be able to be reading the text that you need to read. You might be able to be in Greek. We know that Akilas in Talmud Yerushalmi says Akilas translated the Torah into Greek. There are some texts that survive from these Jewish translations of the Torah into Greek. Obviously, the Targum Shivim, which Chazal say was done by Rabbanim from our circles, is obviously the translation of the Torah into Greek. So there are a bunch of Judeo-Greek translations of the Torah, or Judeo-Greek texts, Jewish texts. Obviously, Philo is written in Greek as well. He lived in Egypt, although he's not fully considered from our rabbinic circles. But there's a rich history of Judeo-Greek, Bisman Chazal as well. And then at some point it seems like, especially in the Bavli, the Chashivas of Judeo-Greek sort of gets downgraded, and we're not Machshav it anymore, and it's just Aramaic. But at least for a minute there, or a few centuries there, Judeo-Greek was also up there as a very Chashava Judeo language that isn't Hebrew. So you have Hebrew, you have Judeo-Greek, you have Judeo-Aramaic, Bisman Chazal. And Judeo-Aramaic, by the way, we say Judeo, and this is negaya to all these discussions. When we say Judeo, we mean that usually means two things. Usually it means that the language is written in Hebrew letters, and as I want to get to and mention, that's what makes English the one exception. That a Judeo-English that's written in Hebrew letters has never arisen, and that's an outlier in 2,000 years of Jewish existence. The fact that there's no fully Judeo-English written in Hebrew letters is actually odd and weird. Even as weird as it would seem to write English in Hebrew letters, it's actually weird that we don't write it in Hebrew letters. So two things: writing it in Hebrew letters, and often that you mix Hebrew in, or at some point your dialect sort of forks off from the main dialect, and maybe you preserve certain words that the rest of the population has moved on from. And this is the same. These are the same patterns in every Judeo language. Another place where we see the influence of Greek is actually on the Lashon HaKodesh of Chazal. So you can look in Mishnayos, look in Gemara, the amount of Greek words that are mixed into Hebrew texts, or even Aramaic words, or Aramaic influence that's seen in the Hebrew text. So often what happens with Judeo languages is that they also then return and influence the Lashon HaKodesh. And Judeo-Arabic definitely had a tremendous impact on Lashon HaKodesh as well. when they translated the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim back into Hebrew, the Ibn Tibbon family, they coined so many terms, so many phrases that we know. This is its own fascinating discussion. The basic terms like Gashmius, Ruchnius, many more terms like that are all actually sort of Hebrew coinings to correspond to existing Arabic terms that was part of the intellectual discourse. Bisman Rishonim, Sajigan, and the Rambam are using this Arabic terminology, this sophisticated Arabic terminology, and in order to, once those teachings came back to Europe, where they didn't speak Arabic and they had to translate it back into Lashon HaKodesh, so they had to create this entire vocabulary, and there are chiburim from Ibn Tibbon, maybe there's another chibur from Yichus to the Rambam, sort of almost like dictionaries explaining these new fancy terms that are being coined. Even the word tava, there's a whole raid around the word tava. Do you find it in Chazal? But more or less, even basic words like tava are words that were coined in Lashon HaKodesh in the Middle Ages as a back translation from Arabic back into Hebrew. And the same thing goes for Yiddish in the later Dairis. As Ashkenazi Jews spoke Yiddish, we find that it filters back into the Hebrew, into the Lashon HaKodesh, and you start seeing words and phrases and syntax that's
syntax. I was going to say that it's more obvious to see it both like in, the Rambam writing sentences, which in Arabic syntax, which has been written about a lot, and in Shuvas Farim, I remember even as a kid finding things like, Heishiv Esatzmo Yetzich gesetzt, or, things like that.
Right. So there are many, and there have been articles either written on specific examples, or the Rambam, or Yiddish. There's a lot of, for those that are interested in this, there definitely is, you can definitely find interesting material that illustrates this topic. So anyway, that's the early history of Judeo languages. Like I said, it's the Judeo-Arabic obviously is a bit earlier than some of the others because, like I said, I think once the Muslims came into existence, came to power, Judeo-Arabic replaced Aramaic. So Talmudic texts were still written mostly in Aramaic or Lashon HaKodesh or whatever combination of those two. But you see that Rebbe Gaon and the Rambam and others, when they want to write on Torah or on Machshava or on other matters, they use Judeo-Arabic. So Judeo-Arabic is actually sort of a higher Judeo language in that it's meant for scholarship as well. Whereas Yiddish, in that sense, for most it was not, and in Chabad it is. Maybe that actually helps enhance the vart that the Rebbe says in the Sikha about Yiddish being on the level of the Aramaic, etc. But that's jumping ahead. So 1,000 years ago, we find that we have these communities. They spring up. They all have independent Rabbanim, Yeshiva, and Psak Halacha, and Minhag, and Nusach HaTfilah as well. The part about the Shar HaKoil and Nusach Haris, the Shar HaKoil, compared to the Yud Bey's Nuschayos, the Yud Bey's Shvatim. And in today's scholarship, it's been pointed out that if you look at the world of Kehillas in the Middle Ages, and look at their Nuschayos, we can map that there were. It's easy to. It's. I don't know if easy is the right word, but one is able to suggest and map that there were essentially 12 major Nuschayos. So you could say 12 Nuschayos, 12 Kehillas, and maybe 12 Judeo languages. You'd have to go down the list to see if each one had its own language docket. But more or less, you have 12. Lamar Zaga, for the sake of the conversation, there are 12 Ark Kehillas and 12 Nuschayos and 12 Judeo languages. So Jews that live in northern France are speaking Judeo-French. Obviously, back then the lines of language and geography were blurrier, but in hindsight, in our terms of today, the Jews in northern France are speaking Judeo-French. The Jews in southern France, Provence, are speaking Judeo-Provencal, or however you pronounce that. The Jews in Germany are speaking Judeo-German. Jews in Italy are speaking Judeo-Italian. And then you go into Spain. Spain has its own interesting history because there was also an Arabic outpost for a while. I think I read that the Jews there only really started speaking Judeo-Spanish, or really, I think even within Spain itself, there's Judeo-Castilian, there's different shades and different Kehillas within Spain. There's Catalonian between Provence and Spain. There's Catalonian. Maybe that's its own Kehillah, its own Nusach, its own Judeo language, Judeo-Catalan. So I think within the previously Muslim areas, I think they actually started speaking their Judeo languages a bit later, which is interesting. So it's not all 1,000 years ago. That's why, like I said, we're simplifying, we're oversimplifying, and you should understand that, and I don't have to repeat the disclaimer again. So Judeo-German, like I said, in Ashkenaz, which is the medieval or the term we use for Germany, they spoke Judeo-German, and they spoke this going back 1,000 years. How do we know that they spoke this going back 1,000 years? So there isn't that much documentation of this. But the best source we have for this is actually Rashi. And those who have been malakit, the earliest examples of Judeo-German text, point to Rashi as the first example, because Rashi in his commentary, in addition to quoting thousands of words in Laz, French, occasionally will also cite words that are B'lashon Ashkenaz. I think within the Pirush al Torah, there's almost nothing. There's the sneer here in Sefer Dvarim now, sneer, B'lashon Ashkenaz, B'lashon Kana. We're not going to get into that Rashi right now. That's also not like quite a Laz. Rashi's not like saying something is Bilaz or B'lashon Ashkenaz. But in the rest of Nach, there are examples, and in Shas, there are examples. And it's sometimes in some versions of Pirush Rashi al Torah, you'll have like a German translation in parentheses after a Laz. We're not talking about that. We're talking about where it's a part of the original text, the original commentary that Rashi wrote, and there are dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, whatever it is, instances where Rashi brings words B'lashon Ashkenaz, and Rashi clearly being the one who liked to use other languages as much as possible, more than those before him and after him in a Talmudic context. So Rashi not only brought thousands of words in French, but also a couple dozen words in the Judeo-German as well. So that is, so essentially, as far as we know, for as long as we know that Jews have been in Ashkenaz, for as long as the Ashkenazi Jewish identity has existed, part of that identity was speaking Judeo-German. What language did they speak before? Halavai, we knew clearly where the Ashkenazi Jews came from. That's part of the whole mystery as to exactly where they came from. So what, did they come from Italy? We don't know. We barely know where they came from, so we can't really speculate as to what language they were speaking. There definitely is some talk about how maybe Aramaic was actually spoken for longer than people realized. We see that in northern France and in Ashkenaz, they wrote a lot of Aramaic piyutim, going very late. Obviously, it wasn't a proper spoken language, but there seems to be some strong use of Aramaic going pretty late. The Yukim Purkans that we say in another Aramaic text in davening are actually, best as we know, early Ashkenazi texts, because they're not attested to in any other community in Nusach, as far as I recall reading. So it's also, it's like, I'm not saying that the Aramaic dialect is different. For that you need experts on Aramaic to tell
you. You're saying, okay, I was not aware that Yukim Purkan is from Ashkenaz, but you're saying that there are Ashkenazi Aramaic piyutim outside of piyutim that are shaykh to Targum?
No, not necessarily. I'm saying the ones that are shaykh to Targum, we can't get into that whole topic right now. Of they used to be Targum on Yom Tov, they would still be Targum in Aramaic, and they had piyutim relating to that, but in that context, there are a lot of. I guess Akdamus obviously is Akdamus is the most famous example.
I kind of always assumed that Yukim Purkan was back from Bavel, but I guess if they were in Bavel, they wouldn't be saying Diba Bavel. They would saying the Basra Adain or whatever.
And I don't know if they'd be mentioning Diba Ara Di Yisrael. The mentioning Diba Ara Di Yisrael, Diba Bavel is sort of Ashkenaz, where you see the connection to Eretz Yisrael is stronger there, and they're acknowledging Eretz Yisrael, but also Bavel. So there's both.
Basically, I only recently realized that, I'm just saying this because it's very interesting to me, and it could be others also that didn't realize yet, that all the things that we mentioned in Yukim Purkan are actually job titles. Like there's a Rosh Kala, there's a Rosh Galvasa, like the Dayan of the Bava. There was a job title in Bavel you were the Dayan of the Bava, and etc. So it's like we're actually mentioning specific job titles. It's not just a way of saying everyone and everything.
Right, sure.
I mean, Reish Galvasa, that's more obvious. Everybody knows there's a Reish Galusa, but I guess the one that was a Chiddush to me was the Yoni Devava. Reish Kala I knew, and those, but Reish Galvasa, that the Yoni Devava is actually a specific job description, was news to me.
I'll add, I think everyone, though, has to have that moment where they chap that Rashi Galvasa is the same as Galus. That in when you see it in the Gemara, we read it the Yeshivish way. We read it and pronounce it as Galusa, but in the Siddur with the Nikud, it's Galvasa, but it's the same word and it's the same term. I suspect that at least 1% of the people watching and listening right now didn't hop until now that Galvasa and Galusa is the same word, just with or without Nikud. But that's a separate, a totally unrelated thing. Again, so as far as we know, going back to the beginning of Yadus Ashkenaz as we know it, the language that they speak is Judeo-German. And this itself is interesting because today there's discussions about Shlishinu as Lashoinam, what exactly that means, how that works. So without turning it into a polemic, clearly we see that 1,000 years ago, a lot of the communities seem to start from scratch. At some point, Aramaic maybe this proves that sometimes an old Judeo language is just too not relevant and too hard to preserve, or whatever the cheshbon was. There's no, I don't think there's any we didn't preserve any documentation about as they say in Ivrit, hitlaptut, levatim, were they troubled by this? Were they tormented by this issue? We have no idea. I don't think there's any documentation of that. So we don't have any insight into what that process looked like. All we know is that, like I said, it almost feels spontaneously around this time. These communities spring to life. Their identity is shaped, and they're very proud of their local identity. And as part of the local identity, they speak the local language. And
it also touches on Shalishino Shemam, because I don't know if this goes back 1,000 years, but certainly in the height of Ashkenaz, people had French and German names.
Although that's its own separate discussion. Is it replacing the Shem Kodesh, or is it a kinoi in addition to the Shem Kodesh?
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have
saying the question is, how does speaking Judeo-German pertain to Shalishunus L'Shoinam, and then also how does those names pertain to Lishunus Shemam?
Right. If we're trying to make this conversation relatable, so even if you're not super into Yiddish or medieval languages, but if you're into names, then often even Pashto people are into understanding, what's their Yiddish name, what's their mother's Yiddish name, or especially if there's confusion about what the name is, what the form of the name is. So all these Yiddish names are all part of this Yiddish discourse to some extent. Especially women. A lot of women that don't have a Hebrew name just have a Yiddish name. For men, it's not really supposed to be the case. You're supposed to have a Hebrew name and the Yiddish name separately, not just the Yiddish name. But even in the last 100 years, 50 years, it's more common for some people to just be named after a grandfather and just have a Yiddish name. We're not going to get into that right now. But yeah, Yiddish is part of if you're an Ashkenazi Jew, even if you're very modern Orthodox or you're very Israeli, like I said, chances are there is some Yiddish in your vocabulary, whether it's 10 words or 20 or 50 words, whatever it is, there still is some Yiddish. And Yiddish, by the way, has shaped Ivrit. It's well known that modern Hebrew translated a lot of Yiddish terms, just like the Lashon HaKodesh hundreds of years ago. Even modern Ivrit translated a lot of Yiddish terms and phrases and expressions back into Hebrew, and so it endures in Hebrew in that way. And same obviously goes, the more Hamish and English you speak, the more of a Yiddish influence there is, even if you're not consciously aware of it. So Yiddish exerts a lot of influence on all Jews of Ashkenazi heritage, or even beyond, whether you realize it or not. So at this point, all these communities are speaking their local language. Like I said, it is though a Judeo version of it, which means they're writing, if they write the words, they write it in Lashon HaKodesh. If they're writing it for themselves, obviously, if they need to use it with authorities, they will write it in Latin letters. But otherwise, it's in Lashon HaKodesh, in the Hebrew alphabet. And presumably, it's hard to know when you don't have that much documentation and you don't have that many texts. It's hard to know. But we assume that even from the beginning, they're probably mixing Hebrew in to some extent, and the Hebrew is shaping the language, and it probably forks off as a dialect, even maybe not dramatically, but maybe in subtle ways. If you have your own culture and your own inner group within a larger group, there tend to be differences in language in some way. So meaning it's not just accurate to say that the Jews were speaking German 1,000 years ago, but it probably is accurate to say that even 1,000 years ago, they were speaking Judeo-German, which was different from regular German in some meaningful way, even if minor way originally. Right, so that's where Yiddish comes from. So Yiddish is connected. So I think this is important to emphasize. Yiddish is connected to Ashkenazi identity going back 1,000 years. Wherever you have Ashkenaz, wherever you have Ashkenazim, from the beginning, Ashkenazim speak Judeo-German. And when you it's fitting that you call yourself an Ashkenazi, right? It's not controversial to call yourself an Ashkenazi today. If you say you're an Ashkenazi, what are you saying? You're saying I am a Judeo-German Jew, or I'm a German Jew. Maybe you don't have to be redundant and say Judeo and Jew, but you're saying you're a German Jew. So if you are identifying as a German Jew, so it follows, and as I want to elaborate a bit more, it follows that you speak the Judeo-German language, which is part of the Judeo-German identity. And this goes for all the other identities as well. So many of those other identities maybe disappeared. We don't have Judeo-French Jews already for many hundreds of years, or Judeo-Catalan. Maybe there are some. I mean, there is still some. There's a Siddur committed Catalonia that's been printed in the last 10, 15 years. So there definitely are some Jews out there that seem to identify as a hemshech to Gaulis Catalonia, but I don't think they're speaking Judeo-Catalan and haven't spoken it for a few hundred years. Well, even Sephardim, the two major communities we speak of today are Ashkenazim and Sephardim, even though it's more complex than that. But if you look at Sephardim, when Sephardim were exiled from Spain, they continued speaking whatever again, we don't call it Judeo-Spanish, it's Judeo-Castilian, or whatever exactly the nuance is. But the term that came to be known by 100, 200 years later is Ladino. And we find that Sephardim continued speaking Spanish, continued speaking Ladino, throughout their diaspora, throughout much of their diaspora, until 100 years ago. And even 100 years ago here in New York, there was a Ladino newspaper, which is not it's not well known, but alongside the Yiddish newspapers, there was a Ladino newspaper for the Sephardic diaspora here in America. And it's surprising to realize how many how many Sephardim there were here, but seems like there were at least 100,000 Sephardim in America even 100 years ago. And for them, their first language and their main language was Ladino, and there was a Ladino newspaper, and you could see the same ads printed in the Yiddish newspaper in Yiddish are printed in the Ladino newspaper in Ladino. And you can find the newspaper online. It's very interesting to see. So we see that Sephardim, just as Sephardim, once they were exiled, they carried this Sephardic identity with them, and the Nusach and the Manhagim and the history, and part of that identity that they carry with them is that language. And they spoke, again, whatever the exact English term would be, but they spoke Spanish, they spoke Ladino, the Jewish version of it. And by the way, they have many songs. The Sephardic world had dozens, if not hundreds, of songs in Ladino that many of which seem to go back to before the Gerush, that they kept as part of their culture. We don't have that Akadekach in the Ashkenazi world.
It's definitely
a whole rich culture that has Ladino at the center in all kinds of ways. There's
definitely still, I mean, even here in Chicago, I've seen there's a Sephardi shul where they still, I think every Shabbos, they sing Ein Kelikenu in Spanish. In Ladino, I mean. I don't remember if they say it in Hebrew and Ladino or only Ladino, probably both. And also, I think that with Ladino, there's the relationship between Ladino and Spanish is perhaps a little bit closer than between Yiddish and German. You did have Teitch marriage, which I don't know if we want to get too much into that. But one recent minhag, which is very interesting, which I saw, was there was an old Sephardi minhag, and you can see this printed in old Sephardi kinnos, that they would translate the Haftorah, Seif HaSifim of Tisha B'Av, into Ladino, and yet they have the translation printed in Ladino. But that recently Sephardi communities have even printed in the Machzor, whatever, that they translate the Haftorah into Spanish. Printed in Latin letters, not in Aleph base. So anyway, those are just, I guess, side points which we probably don't have too much time to talk about.
Right. So yeah, Tisha B'Av related. There are interesting examples of that. But first, you have to have a koch in Yiddish, and as an Ashkenazi, I think you have to start from Yiddish, and then you can, like I said, then you broaden your horizon. You see, there's like a whole history of Judeo languages, and Yiddish is one piece of that. But there's a lot more to it. So back to Yiddish, and as I already mentioned, the Sephardim have a Sephardic diaspora because they had a Gerush, and this is the idea that they kept their identity, including their language, as they moved elsewhere, without getting into the details. So the case with Yiddish is, and a very important step and stage in the history of Yiddish is, that there is also an Ashkenazi diaspora, meaning that there are Ashkenazi Jews are no longer limited just to those who live in Germany proper. First of all, even within Germany Gufa, there's Western Germany and there's Eastern Germany and there's Austria, and even Bohemia is sort of the outer reaches. But even beyond that, around the late 13th, but certainly in the 14 and 1500s, suddenly we start finding that Ashkenazi Jews, German Jews, are no longer necessarily living in Germany itself, but rather there is an Ashkenazi diaspora. The diaspora we are mostly familiar with is Jews moving east, and in the 1500s, as we know, rather famously, almost the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world is no longer in Germany anymore, but rather in Poland. So suddenly you have the Ramah, the Marshal, and then there's a kalim that come afterwards. You look at the Shulchan Aruch, and all the Ashkenazi commentaries in the Shulchan Aruch don't even live in Germany. The one Ashkenazi commentary by the Chavis Yar, the Makar Chaim, is not even didn't even get printed and make it into the Shulchan Aruch, and ended up being printed much later. So you look at the text. No, I'm probably oversimplifying, but it goes to show you that the center of gravity, the center of the Ashkenazi world, is no longer in Germany. Germany sometimes almost feels like a satellite of the larger Ashkenazi world.
Polish.
Which is centered in Poland, which then, as time goes on, in the 1700s, Poland gets partitioned, and you end up having the Jewish communities of Lithuania, the Jewish communities of Belarus, Jews that are living under the Russian Empire, etc., etc. So to simplify, you just say Eastern Europe. Eastern European Ashkenazim become the majority of Ashkenazim and are no longer anywhere near Germany, although, okay, within Poland is Prussia. We're not getting into the nuance. Within Eastern Europe, you have non-German Ashkenazi Jews, Yiddish-speaking Jews. And you also still have a base of Ashkenazim still back in Germany, back in those lands, and that's Western Europe. And you have this distinction, Bechlal, between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, which I think is a very important distinction that's negayah to a lot of inyanim for a different time. But just for the purpose of the languages, you have Eastern European Yiddish, or as it came to be known as Eastern Yiddish for short, and then you have Western European, more like the original German community, the German-speaking Jews, Judeo-German-speaking Jews. You have the Western Yiddish as well. That's the story about the Ashkenazi diaspora that's negayah to us now. There also was, at least in the 1500s, Ashkenazi diaspora in Italy, and the dafka was a lot of Yiddish that was produced and printed, and a lot of Yiddish that came from the Ashkenazim in Italy. But that's a separate discussion for another time. It's not directly negayah to Yiddish-speaking Jews today. But the reason why,
parenthetically, the Yiddish that let's say we speak in Lubavitch, or maybe called Russian Yiddish, what is that called? I mean, it's even further than Eastern Yiddish. But what is it? What do they usually refer to that to as?
No, falls under the rubric of Eastern. I mean, there's more nuance. You look at the real academics; they'll be like Southern Yiddish. They have more. There's more shades of distinction there that I haven't adopted yet into my own framework. I don't look at that and say, "Oh, that's Southern Yiddish." That's not. I'm not on that madrega yet. So for me, it's enough to distinguish between Eastern Yiddish and Western Yiddish. So the reason why I speak Yiddish, or you speak Yiddish, or we could speak Yiddish if we want to, whatever the definition of speaking is, the reason why any Jew that you know speaks Yiddish is because, we could say, Bimagdir, is because Jews 500-600 years ago moved from Ashkenaz to the Eastern European lands, first mainly Poland and then beyond, and they carry that Ashkenazi identity with them, the halachas and the minhagim. And if you know anything about halacha and minhag, you know that just now we came from the 3 weeks, the 9 days. Why do we observe the 3 weeks and the 9 days the way we do? Because we're Ashkenazim. What does that mean? It means that our ancestors, presumably somewhere in the 1500s, picked up their stuff and they moved from Germany. They ended up in Poland and Eastern European lands, and they carried those minhagim of the 3 weeks and the 9 days with them, and that's how they continued observing Judaism. And for 900 years, across the Jewish world, it was sort of a given that if you observe Judaism, it's through one of these 12 kehillas, one of these 12 modes of halacha, minhag, nusach, and often language goes along with that. So they continued speaking German, the Judeo-German, even once they were no longer in German-speaking lands, right? So in Poland, it's hard to, I'm sure, at some, different times, at different places, German may have been a language that the nobility spoke. That wasn't the reason, as far as I know, that they continued speaking it. The reason was because they carried that identity with them, and they never fully assimilated with the new identity. We know that Jews in Poland could not speak Polish properly until, depending on, take a Haredi Yid, the most Haredi of Haredi Yid, they could not speak Polish until the last 100 to 150 years, although words and the vocabulary obviously seeped in. Then Jews who came from Poland to Russia, to the extent that they knew some non-Yiddish words, they still knew Polish more than they knew Russian. So there was a lot of resistance to absorbing the new culture around them. And this is negaya to the Yiddish speakers today, right? What Yiddish speaking today means that you're sort of resisting English, that you don't want to assimilate into the English speaking lands around you. So Yiddish itself flipped from, clearly when they started speaking Yiddish, it was a certain degree of assimilation, of being absorbed into, we're speaking German, they're speaking French, they're speaking Provençal, they're speaking Catalan. So clearly 1,000 years ago, whatever was going on was a bit different, where they were sort of speaking the language, and their language would have been mutually intelligible with the people, with their neighbors, with the people around them. But then once you move, especially for Ashkenazim, for the last 500 years, what's sort of baked into Yiddish, speaking Yiddish, is this resistance and being removed and being separate and disconnected from the people around you. So that's also important to understand when we talk about Yiddish discourse today in the Haredi world, that it is a part of it. That speaking, and even you see with the Rebbe, as it came up in the conversation, where it's almost like if you speak Yiddish, it seems to go along the other half of the coin is no limud yichayil, no teaching English. So that connotation is sort of, you could say, 500 years old. So that's, these are all important things to understand. So as I'm emphasizing, when I start talking about debating Yiddish today, what language should we speak? But in order to really appreciate the significance and the stakes and the meaning and the significance, you have to zoom out and look at Yiddish 500 years ago, and that choice, that decision to continue speaking Yiddish, even where it was no longer the language of the people around them.
Yeah. Also, not mamish the point you're making, and maybe we need to revisit this later in the conversation. But the degree to which Yiddish, let's say, spoken in the 1700s in Poland, was influenced by Polish, versus the degree to which Yiddish today in, say, Borough Park or Williamsburg is influenced by English, is probably very different.
Maybe not so different. I wanted to get to that point, at least about the next step in Yiddish pretty soon. But yeah, also to get back to, like you say, to like sort of compare the influences. So hopefully we'll get back to that point. So like I said, first of all, there's this decision to not speak the local language. But I think more fundamentally, and I don't think that was the main reason. The main reason was because you're carrying that identity with you. And I think it's important to understand that. So when we speak of our identity today, I've liked this in the past. I like to say that if you want to identify ourselves where we are in the world today, we sort of have this hyphenated identity. So obviously we're Jews, and our identity goes all the way back to Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni and Chazal. But like I said, we don't even know exactly where Ashkenazim came from, so I can't give an accurate identity before that. And this new identity sort of starts 1,000 years ago, whether you're an Ashkenazi, you're a Tzarfati, you're a Sephardi. So we'll start from 1,000 years ago, which is the meaningful point in time for the modern Jewish identity. So we are Ashkenaz hyphen Poland, meaning because at some point the meaning of Poland clearly was distinct enough from the Minhagim back in Ashkenaz proper. There were meaningful differences. So it's mutually intelligible, you could say, but it's already two different worlds. So we're Ashkenaz, Poland / Eastern Europe / whatever you want to call it. And then maybe after the Poland hyphen, you can add Russia, because at some point the identities splintered further between whether you're a Polish-er, you're a Russisch-er, this or that. All those terms that were used, are still used to some extent till today, are identities that go back, let's say, 300 years. So we're Ashkenaz, Poland, let's say Russian, if you come from Chabad, and then the Chabad identity is tacked on after that, where then as Chabad, as Chassidim, we then took on certain minhagim and certain things that distinguish us from the other Jews living around us. So all of those identities are hyphenated, and they're all very important to understand. So if you're a Lubavitcher, you think, oh, I'm just a Lubavitcher, that's your identity. But no. First of all, you know you're an Ashkenazi, more or less. You do know that deep down that you're an Ashkenazi. It's not just a word. It's very important. It's a very important part of your identity, because everything is building on the previous identity. And Chabad isn't born in a vacuum. Chabad is built on the Ashkenaz, Poland, Russian identity, or whatever you want to call it. The Reisische, back then would have been Reisen, Belarus. But you look on the old Slichas, the old they say Kaminig. They would list the different regions in that area. So there would be, Bemen is Bohemia, and Poland, and it would be Reisen, Litte, Zamot. So Reisen had its own identity in terms of minhag, in terms of nusach, that already going back 300-400 years. So you could say, we're Ashkenaz, Poland, Reisen, Chabad. And
Yeah.
that's going to be very
I
important
think
to...
Yeah, just one thing in terms of minhagim, really not a topic for now, but just to sort of highlight what you're saying. There are many minhagim that we have that maybe people call Chabad minhagim, and maybe nowadays Chabad may be the quote unquote the only ones who do it. But b'yisoidam, they're not Chabad minhagim; they're Russian minhagim. Comes to mind stepping over a silver spoon into the yichud room, and possibly even the minhag of saying an extra mishnah with the kaddish after davening, and many minhagim that we have. That b'yisoidam, they're nothing to do with Chabad. They're geographical and used to be shared by other, what we might call Olam Yidden who lived in those same cities.
Exactly. I'm sure there are more halachic examples as well. I mean, even the chalukah of the aliyas for Kriyas HaTorah, that Chabad, Parshas Nasai, the way I've always understood it is that was just local to the Chamashim that were printed in that geographical area, printed it that way. So yeah, that identity, yeah.
One example, a good example that comes to mind is about printing. The Aruch HaShulchan in his whole discussion, Yedua, the Aruch HaShulchan was very familiar with, he was in Babroisk, which, very much is common geographical with our history. So one thing that struck me was he writes by Shmini Atzeres that in most Sidurim, it says, B'yom Shmini Atzeres HaChag Hazeh. There's three different options, whether you say Shmini Atzeres Chag Hazeh, Chag Shmini Atzeres Hazeh, etc. So he says most Sidurim say Shmini Atzeres HaChag Hazeh, which that's our minhag, and it probably was most Sidurim where the Aruch HaShulchan lived, but I think that if you collect all Sidurim, which would identify as being Ashkenazi Sidurim, I don't think it's true to say that most of them have that. I think Chag Shmini Atzeres Hazeh or something is much more common in the overall.
Right, but the Aruch HaShulchan is a great example where it's been said before that if you're a Lubavitcher and you read the Aruch HaShulchan, you will feel there's a certain kinship, the practices, certain nuances that he expresses actually feel very particularly personal and relatable to a Lubavitcher because he's coming from that same environment. All right, so to recap, what we've said until now is that number one, Yiddish is one of the European judeo languages that goes back 1,000 years, and that's a very meaningful point in time because that's when the identities of the Kehillas and the Minhagim that are followed till today were established, and it seems like the languages went along with the Minhag HaKehillah. Not to say that speaking that language was the Minhag HaKehillah or that it was explicitly given kedusha or significance, but just there's clearly a very strong historical link and significance to these Kehillas coming into being with their Minhagim, with their ways of doing things, and that language seems to be very strongly attached to it. And obviously, as we know, some of those Kehillas disappeared. Like I said, you don't really find that much of, let's say, northern France, Minhag Tzarfas, etc. But of those Kehillas that slowly disappeared, so the language disappearing probably is again connected to a Kehillah also disappearing. And I'm sure that if you go and look it up and see what those who are philosophers of language or of tribal identity have to say, I'm sure it's a given that there's always a strong link, although I'm sure it's not black and white either, but there's definitely a strong connection. So that's Judeo-German goes back 1,000 years. For as long as we know that there were Ashkenazim, they spoke this Lashon Ashkenaz. That was the Hebrew term that was used for most of the history, and maybe we'll return soon to the use of that term, because at some point the Rebbe disavowed that term for the Yiddish that we speak now. But historically, that's what it was. That was the idea. And then the next major step is around 500 years ago when the center of the Ashkenazi world shifts out of Ashkenaz proper into the neighboring lands, into Eastern Europe. Those Ashkenazis continue speaking this language, and like I said, that almost seems to then turn into a way of keeping their identity, a way of not absorbing into the local culture, and as we said, it was avoiding speaking Polish, avoiding speaking Russian, and
perhaps somewhat ironically, Dafka, what they call the Yakas, the Yotze of the Western Ashkenaz, did not
Mhm.
really keep up speaking Lashon Ashkenaz.
So there's a fascinating thing. Wasn't necessarily going to mention it, but let's you take the Hungarian Jewry. So German Jewry in Germany itself had major tzimtzum in the 1800s. Shamshul Hirsch is like the yesh after the ayin in Hasidic terms of it almost vanished, and he brought it back in some limited form. But l'chera, by then it's hard to say whether what they were speaking in Germany still counts as Western Yiddish or whether it just counts as speaking proper German at that point. We're not here to trace the evolution of every step of Western Yiddish and Eastern Yiddish, but it would be debatable if they were speaking, a form of Western Yiddish or at that point it's just German. But within that world gufa, the center of that world, you could say, shifted to Hungary because Chassam Sofer came from Frankfurt and he embodied those minhagim, and his talmidim after him also continued being the embodiment of those minhagim. So the fascinating thing is that we know that in Hungary has its own fascinating history of minhag and Chassidus. So while the Tenuas Chassidus started in the mid to late 1700s and spread in parts of Ukraine, the Chassidus only came to Hungary much later, like 100 years later, in the mid to late 1800s, and that's when it really swept through Hungary. When we look at the Hungarian Haredi world today, and it's 99% Chassidish, it's important to note that, first of all, even in the 1800s, that meant that it was slowly capturing and taking over yeshivas, kehillas, where they had followed Minhagei Ashkenazi. The Chassam Sofer, the Hungarian world is half Chassam Sofer, half Chassidus. The Chassam Sofer identity is still very strong, but not in terms of specific minhagim. So you had Talmidei Chassam Sofer, Talmidei Chassam Sofer that had that Ashkenazi identity, and they were like, even as Rosh Hashiva in their 40s and 50s and 60s, they were suddenly being mekabel, the moros of Chassidus. And I have seen specifically described that some of them literally had been speaking Western Yiddish, and they switched over and started speaking a more Polish, Eastern Chassidish Yiddish. So that was also, you see mamash, first of all, you see how it's like literally part of identity, where like by assuming this Hasidic identity, they literally had to switch the Yiddish to Chassidish Yiddish from the more Germanic Yiddish. But also we see that this was where Western Yiddish was still prevalent. And as far as I understand, through World War I, through World War II, there still were significant pockets within Hungary who spoke, some would say they're just speaking German. To my understanding, I think it's fair to say that some of them were speaking what could be called Western Yiddish. You also find the newspapers that were being written, other things that were being written until World War II. Some of them were written in a much more Germanic kind of Yiddish, not like a Hamish Yiddish that we would read easily. And somewhere after World War II, it basically disappeared, went extinct. And even in terms of minhagim, moistus like Wien and moistus like that, till 20, 30 years ago, still had that Ashkenaz identity. I don't know how many of them were still speaking anything that could be described as Western Yiddish or German. And even just in the last 30 years, those pockets seem to have gone extinct. So these are all fascinating developments, mentioning Yakus and Western Yiddish. So that's the end of the history of Western Yiddish as a distinct dialect, as a spoken language. But yeah, like that's a side point, not directly negaya to what we're focusing more on Eastern Yiddish, as we'll get to shortly, and on the Yiddish that we speak, that we know, or the other communities that we know speak. So that's the story with that. One more important thing that I should mention, that's very tied to the identity of being a Yiddish speaker and speaking Yiddish, is the Indian of teitch. And I'm going to mention this very briefly because if I start talking about it too long, it's going to cannibalize the whole discussion. But it's, even personally for me, my introduction to Yiddish, my shar into Yiddish, definitely went through teitching in Cheder. And it's sort of like the canary in the coal mine. If a community still teitches in the Cheder, that means they still have epis hashaychus to Yiddish, they still have a certain aspiration to Yiddish, something. When you drop the teitch, that's basically goodbye to Yiddish. So they are very strongly connected in that way. like even though I don't know if the Rebbe and all these minus and sichas, I don't know if the Rebbe ever spoke about teitch specifically. Maybe there is some minor to not teitch in Yiddish in communities where they really don't know Yiddish. So that's maybe the extent of the. But as a positive thing, I don't know if the Rebbe talked about it too much. The Rebbe obviously did mention some of the teitchen that he learned in the Cheder, and I've written about those, like the more the rare teitchen that even back in the Cheder 150 years ago they didn't really understand exactly what they meant, which is its own fascinating thing. So just to address teitch briefly, so we all know that in Yiddish-speaking communities we teitch in Cheder. The way you learn Chumash is you say a word of Chumash and you teitch it. It's originally supposed to be literally one word at a time. At some point, maybe the Rebbe started combining words, a few Hebrew words at a time, a few the teitch for those words together at a time. So people, just like with Yiddish, they don't really understand how far Yiddish goes back, what the story of Yiddish is, so people don't really understand the history of teitch, where teitch comes from. But this is a subject that those who know me know I've looked into it. I think I've recorded maybe one or two stuff before on this topic, on individual words, individual translations of words. So the bottom line is that teitch is documented and attested to probably from the mid to late 1300s. And we have manuscripts that contain teitch words, not a flowing teitch on the entire Chumash word for word, but on all the key words and all the hard words and all the difficult words, which is itself a very important way of understanding Chumash, understanding Rashi, understanding when you're trying to learn Chumash and understand Chumash and explain Chumash, the component of difficult words is a very key component, doesn't fully get appreciated today, I don't think. So the original idea of these teitch manuscripts was to shtel sich, as we say, to be misakev on those difficult words and give the Yiddish translation for those words. The rest, it was assumed, I guess, that were given. You didn't have to tie choice, as we say, not to get into the whole history of the word teitch and all the meanings of how the word teitch is used. Teitch, on its simple level, is Miloshin Deutsch, which is German. So originally just meant that you're saying it in Deutsch. So just as it's called Loshin Ashkenaz in Hebrew, so somewhere around 13, 14, 15, even 1600s, when you wanted to write in your showerblatt that your book was in Yiddish, so you could either write it's Beloshin Ashkenaz. If you wanted to write in German and Yiddish that it was Beloshin Ashkenaz, so you could write it's written Beloshin Teitch. I think in one showerblatt in the 1600s it says in teitcher Sprach with a test, without getting into the history of the word Deutsch and teitch and the etymology and all that. That's what it meant originally. And then in Yiddish, teitch came to have these more general meanings of to teitchen, to explain, to elaborate, etc. So teitch is, I can't say it's as old as Yiddish itself, because we can't prove that they were teitching in the 1000s or 1100s, but it has been around for the majority of the history of Yiddish. It's definitely since the 1300s. And my thesis is that it's actually based on a French translation tradition, but that's for another time. But just to appreciate how far back these things are going, how deeply rooted these things are, by the time you get to the, I believe it's the early 1600s, you have, there's a Sefer Be'er Moshe that was printed in Prague, which was the same format. It's a list of the harder words with their translations, and it's printed for the Malamdim to use, so they don't get stuck. The Malamdim, the average Malamdim knew the teitch for the simple words. Maybe he gets stuck on the harder words. So that idea of giving the list of the hard words and the teitchen, but it was printed by someone that was a shtickle, he was a Talmud of the Moral's brother, and we find that there were some Kehilas at the time that wrote takanas of chinuch, and they said that the Malamdim all have to use the Sefer Be'er Moshe. So there's even like this takanas, there's mandates sort of relating to it, and how to teitch and what to use for teitch. So the place, even though teitch doesn't get quoted a lot in Sfarim, and often people look at it as a childish thing, and once they grow up they don't really think about it too much. First of all, like I said, it comes from a more serious place. Like I think it comes from a French translation tradition, which itself is based on the Pirushim of Rashi and the other Mefarshim in France, without getting into all of that. But and like I said, the Ikar, it's focusing on the difficult words, which I think are a very important component of explaining, understanding the Torah. Is focusing on what exactly the difficult words mean. The difficult words are 10% of the words in Torah are actually not. It's not very clear exactly what they mean. So the translation there is not much more important. So having a list of translations for those words actually is a very significant contribution to understanding the Torah. That's why I now that I found these sources, I kochzich in them, because it's not just something we do as children, but there's actually a lot of thought that goes into how to translate the difficult words. So there's that component of it, and clearly it's part of that Ashkenazi identity. If you're teaching in Cheder, you're teaching children, you want them to understand Chumash, and you're translating it into the language that they speak, that they understand. So that's a linchpin. It's a very important part of a community's identity as Yiddish speakers, that from the age of 5, 6, whenever you start teitching, whenever you start explaining, whenever you start teaching Chumash, the teitch is right there, is a component of that. I have mentioned that it's interesting, comes to, let's say, Manishtana. That's a bit of a trickier one, where there's already a tradition to say the Manishtana in Yiddish. And that's also one of the places where in Chabad, by the way, if you want to talk about Makaris and Chabad, the Manishtana is like an interesting example where you want to follow Minhag Chabad, right? So the Rebbe didn't say, they talk about, there's no Mifza Yiddish, right? But there's Minhag Chabad. Certain things you got to do them with this in the Rebbe's Haggadah. So in the Rebbe's Haggadah state, you have to say Manishtana in Yiddish. Now, why do you have to say Manishtana in Yiddish? The Rebbe connects it to this idea that it should be understood, the children should understand it. It should be verstandig for the kinder. The Rebbe brings Makaris from French Makaris about translating the Haggadah into French for the Nashim and the Ktanim. So this actually creates this conundrum where, weiter, if the whole point is, you say the Sakabe, or all these other examples, if the whole point is, or like Aramaic, Amo, the whole point is that it's the language that the kids understand, so what do you do in a matzav now where the kids don't understand it? So you're going to say translate it just switch to English. However, the Frierdiker Rebbe says somewhere that the Manishtana in Yiddish it comes from the Baal Shem Tov, Talmidei Baal Shem Tov. There's something deeper to it. It's not just Stam L'Shem Teitching. So that's maybe one of the good examples of where you see that Yiddish is not just the Arum, it's baked into certain parts of Hasidic Hanhaga. For example, here in the Haggadah, like how do you get around that? You don't want to get into that situation where the kid doesn't understand Yiddish, but you have the minig the besser to figure out before that how to make the kid understand it. Right, so it happens to be in Chabad, it's the Manishtana, not the teitching the Chumash. But before you get to the Manishtana, you start by teitching the Chumash. So teitch is a very important part of it. And so again, it's interesting to see how far back it goes, how deeply rooted it is, and that there's a very rich history there with regard to Yiddish generally and with regard to teitch specifically.
You can't not mention the Kaddish when the Tata kommt daheim from Shul, etc., which really goes through all 15 Simonim of the Seder in Yiddish as well.
Right. Right, because it's a separate question of what are the origins and what are the history of Kaddish Urchatz in Yiddish, and what's the origin history of Manishtana in Yiddish, and Lavdafka go back as far as teitch, for example. I've looked into this, and even like I said, Manishtana, the Frierdiker Rebbe says it's from Talmidei Baal Shem Tov, which on the one hand, okay, it's not from 100 years ago, but on the other hand, the fee compared to everything else that I'm saying, Talmidei Baal Shem Tov is not that old, it's not that far back. But it ties into what I said at the beginning about how for some people the whole Yiddish in their mind only goes back to around that era, and so it sort of makes sense that certain things might be just from that era onward. And these are all things that could get their own 10, 20, 30-minute individual discussion. We're trying to wrap them all in here. Obviously, at the beginning we said we're going to try to keep this all to 1 hour. That's obviously wishful thinking. Hopefully, we'll keep it closer to an hour and a half total. Rather, between an hour and a half and 2 hours. Hopefully, closer to an hour and a half. So fast forward to Chabad. So as I explained, Chabad is the next hyphenated identity that builds on top of all the identities that come before it. And so Yiddish is obviously a big part of that because, as I explained, Yiddish is baked into the history of Jews in these places, including Eastern Europe, and that's a big part of the story. So Yiddish is of course there. We know Yiddish comes up in Tanya when the Alter Rebbe is explaining one Inyan in Tzavos Rivash. The Alter Rebbe says that Baal Shem Tov spoke in Yiddish, and whoever wrote it down in Hebrew, you can't be medayik in the Hebrew because it's just an approximate rishima, hanacha as we call it today in Chabad. Bechlal, there's a whole discussion today whether it's Tzavos Rivash is really the Baal Shem Tov or it's the Maggid's Titus or whatever. That's not directly negated. The point is the Yiddish versus the versus the Lashon HaKodesh. So there you see the Alter, and I think the Rebbe is mitzayin to that, maybe also in that Sikha about Yiddish and Chabad. So that's an example where, as I said, B'chlal, Yiddish was not really the language of scholarship. Now there is like I just alluded to earlier, there's a rich history of Jewish publications. Tenerena is probably the most famous of the pre-17, 1800s Yiddish that is still around in some form. In the Chassidus world, I think they have like modernized versions of the Tenerena still around. But once the printing press came into, not the first decades, but the 15th, 1600s in Poland, they started printing various Yiddish works for women. Often it's described as for women and children, or for the simpler men. But obviously anyone who considered themselves a scholar tried to write and to read in Lashon HaKodesh. And there's definitely you look out there in the Welt on scholarship about cultures with multiple languages, and this is not an uncommon thing where you have one language for this and one language for that, and even within the Talmudic world, right? Like we said before, the Gemara is in Aramaic, so a lot of Talmudic literature is in Aramaic. So even if you know Lashon HaKodesh, even if you learn Chumash and Cheder and you know Lashon HaKodesh well enough to read Lashon HaKodesh, but can you read the Talmudic Rabbinic Aramaic? Lav dafka. Can you read very flowery militzas that are Lashonis of Psukim and Chazal stitched together? Maybe not. So there are levels and dargis to that. But no serious scholarly work appeared in Yiddish at any time before Chassidus that I know of. It was always directed to the simpler folk. There is an interesting sefer on Hilchos Nida, for example, written by the Masas Binyamin. Seder Hanashim, I believe it's called. It's been reprinted with the translation into Hebrew, which is it's a fascinating source, because you get to see how Hilchos Nida was taught practically to women in Yiddish in the 1600s. What was explained and how it was explained, and you can also see certain help.
Right?
On the spot, it's hard for me to say exactly. It's easy to look up. But you could see B'chlal, which halachas and minhagim and dikdukim didn't exist yet. He couldn't have written about them because they didn't exist yet. It's a nice snapshot in time to see how Hilchos Nida were taught practically to women and in Yiddish, and if you were able to train yourself to read that Yiddish. So this also gets to this point that is important to explain, which is this difference between Western Yiddish and Eastern Yiddish. So once the Yidden moved east.
If you're mentioning that, you should also mention that that's now been translated back into Lashon HaKodesh, so if somebody wants to see it without...
Yeah, so there's a Zichron Aaron edition where when they first printed the Masas Binyamin, reprinted it, they just put a facsimile of the Seder Hanashim without retyping it and translating it, but then they got someone to work on it, so now there's a retyped version with a translation on the facing page. So even if you can't hope to understand the Yiddish, you could at least look at the translation. This gets to a point about the history of written Yiddish and the history of spoken Yiddish and the different dialects. So as we've been alluding to, Jews moved eastward, and then at some point there's this distinction between Eastern Yiddish and Western Yiddish. So what's the difference? The difference is that in Western Yiddish, Western Yiddish spoken in Germany, by the time you get to Mendelssohn, was considered a bit backward and not, just like those that speak Hamish English, Yinglish today, it's not considered quite on par with proper English. So a bit, but the Western Yiddish spoken in Germany among Charedim was a bit backward. And part of what Mendelssohn was doing with his translation of the Chumash was that he translated it into an updated, higher German in Oisius Lashon HaKodesh, but it wasn't the Hamish Western Yiddish. But even the Hamish Western Yiddish is still very far from our Yiddish, and it was a lot closer to German. What happened was that as Jews moved away from Germany and weren't really around German speakers, so languages really then tend to fork off and evolve in a direction of their own. And the way Eastern Yiddish is characterized is that it has a lot of Slavic influences, so a lot of vocabulary. The big example they give is chach. Chach is a pure Slavic word, so if you want to analyze a text to see whether it's Western Yiddish or Eastern Yiddish, if it uses chach, then you know that it's already heading in the Eastern Yiddish direction. I think a bunch of the words that start with ch tend to be Slavic. Maybe that's an overstatement. So this happened gradually. Already in the 1600s, Eastern Yiddish was already distinct enough from Western Yiddish. And
Is this connected to the B'nai Ches thing? Well,
no,
I'm not,
so we won't get into that right now. So it was becoming, and the syntax was different. Things were shifting, and it's getting closer to the Yiddish that you and I know. And that's the Yiddish that we know is a product of that Yiddish evolving, that Eastern Yiddish evolving in the direction that it did. But very interestingly, throughout this time, when it came to written texts, the Eastern and Western Yiddish worlds shared the same text. So the texts were still in like a Western Yiddish register. So within Yiddish Gufa, there was like the written register and the spoken register. And the written was more Western and the spoken was more Eastern. And the chaykrim of the history of printed works in Yiddish in the 1800s, so they trace how this chibur printed in the 1700s is the first one that has the word chach in it and other such characteristics, but it still took a long time. Also, the Yiddish was printed in like a very special font, which is also annoying on the eye for us today. Today, the Yiddish system, they call it the teitch font. That's the nickname they have for it, or the Tenerena font is another term they use for it. So that font was used for most Yiddish works up until like the 1810s, 1820s. There's also this funny, convention in Yiddish texts that the Lashon HaKodesh words were enclosed in parentheses and sometimes in square letters, like to distinguish between the Lashon HaKodesh and the Yiddish. So when you see an old Yiddish text, it's like annoying to read, but it's outside the language, but it's not in proper Eastern Yiddish that we read, that we know. And side because of these other conventions. So that's another reason why no one is really familiar with, no one's really looking at Yiddish texts before a certain point in time, which contributes to like this cutoff where Yiddish only really exists to us from the last 200 years or so.
does the Aleph base in the front of the Torah or Siddur, doesn't it include the Yiddish font as well?
Could be. It could be it was still in use to here and there till later. But the big break happened in the Eastern lands around the 1810s, 1820s, when they overthrew the yoke of the teitch font, and they started advertising that the Yiddish in this book is Boisis Murubois with Nikud, a whole different direction than had been used until then. This happened 1810s, 1820s is around the time of the Mitteler Rebbe. We have the Mitteler Rebbe, as I want to get to, used Yiddish a lot, is a pioneer in the use of Yiddish for Chassidus. And one of the things Mitteler Rebbe wrote is Bekeach Ivrim, which is debatable whether it's a proper Chassidic text or it should be defined as something else. It's like a guide for Bali Tshuva, in the old fashion of giving Bali Tshuva a really hard time, of Tikkunei Tshuva. And I believe the first print of Bekeach Ivrim, it certainly has like the parentheses, like the Lashon HaKodesh words in parentheses. I think it may even be in the teitch font. It's definitely like a harder read. It's hard. You can still see like it's like literally the Mitteler Rebbe is literally at the border in time between when Yiddish texts started looking normal versus what they looked like before. The two pioneers of Yiddish and Chassidus are Breslov and Chabad, Reb Nosson of Breslov and Mitteler Rebbe of Chabad. Nosson of Breslov printed Tzipori Maisius of Menachem of Breslov with Lashon HaKodesh and the Yiddish, which is its own. Tzipori Maisius is of course its own interesting work. It's not a straight Hasidic work. It's interesting. But so interestingly, the two groups that are known for hafatza in the Chabad term, or whatever term the Breslovers would use, but printing things to make things accessible for people, going out of the way in that context, in the context of print, which most other Chassidic groups do not have. So it's notable that both of them were pioneers in the use of Yiddish, even for a more regular audience, even for a regular male audience that could just use an easier read to reach them where they are. So okay, I'm intertwining different points here that I want to make. So it's just important to understand how Eastern Yiddish evolved somewhere around the 1810s and 1820s. Let's say you had Chumashim that translated the whole Torah in a flowing translation. You had that going back to the 1500s. So you throughout each century you had a couple of those. They weren't even that popular back in the day because Lav Dafka, they're identical to what teitching is. Teitching was more of the thing as opposed to just a flowing translation. We're not getting into that either. But there always were every few decades they printed a flowing Yiddish translation of the Torah. So up until the 1810s, 1820s, if you were to go read them now, it would be annoying to read because it's not, the syntax is different, the vocabulary is different. Around the 1810s, 1820s, all of a sudden the translations of Tanakh are completely overhauled to a much more readable Yiddish that you and I, if you have a pretty strong Yiddish, it would still feel a little archaic, a little antiquated to our eyes today, but definitely eminently readable. If you grew up and you know the Chumash Beis Yehuda, the Beis Yehuda Chumash that had a flowing translation of Chumash, that translation is based on these new translations of the 1810s and the 1820s. So in the time Mitteler and Tzemach Tzedek, there was this big break.
Definitely Yosef Murabois. Beis Yehuda Chumash is definitely Yosef Murabois, if I recall correctly.
So it's Yosef Murabois, it has Nikud, and that's all a tradition that began in the 1810s, 1820s with overhauling the Yiddish, switching to Yosef Murabois, adding Nikud. That's all a Chiddush from that point. And also conceptually, that's when Eastern Yiddish severed itself from Western Yiddish, and more importantly, severed itself from German. So up until then, even if you lived in a Winkel of Ukraine, you sort of had this awareness that you are speaking Judeo-German. Like, consciously in your mind, you would have said, I'm speaking Judeo-German, or whatever terminology you would have used for that, but you would have been aware that that's what you're speaking. And Balashon Ashkenaz would be the term in Hebrew to convey that. Somewhere around that time is where, by making all these changes, and they used to write in the Sharblat, Balashon Ashkenaz, I think they still use the words Balashon Ashkenaz, but Hamudu Beres Beinenu. Like, very emphasizing that this is no longer that archaic written stuff from 200 years ago. This is up to date of how we actually speak. So that was a very clear break and disconnect. And very interestingly, we have from the Tzemach Tzedek, there are a number of tshuvos of the Tzemach Tzedek, where the Tzemach Tzedek discusses terms in Yiddish and defines Yiddish. One of the questions is how do you spell certain names in Yiddish? Speaking of, we mentioned names earlier as an example of where Yiddish is part of our lives, even if you don't speak Yiddish, but if you have Yiddish names in your family, that's an example of Yiddish. So in Gittin, it's very important to spell names correctly. Now, how do you determine what the correct spelling is? And what if there's a gap between how the Sifrei Gittin from 300 years earlier say to spell it, which is maybe a more Germanic way of spelling it? What if there's a gap between that and how it's spoken today, and how you would spell how it's spoken and how it's pronounced today? So there's actually a Shuvah Tzemach Tzedek. I don't remember the Maramakim right now, but I can find it easily again. But Tzemach Tzedek says very clearly that we no longer peg Yiddish to German, meaning even if you're going to prove to me that in German the correct form of the word is such and such, and therefore it should be spelled such and such, and you're going to say that we're saying it b'shibush, it's incorrect compared to German. No, at this point it's severed, and we speak our own. It doesn't use the word Yiddish. It's been pointed out the word Yiddish itself, the name Yiddish as a nickname for this language, is comparatively late. Like, I tried looking it up a little bit. Like, you look on the Sharbletter. The place to look is on the Sharbletter of Sfarim. When they say that the Sefer is in this language, how do they describe it? So also you have to know how to spell. Is Yiddish with an Aleph? Is Yiddish with a Yud? Is it Yud Vav, Dalad Yud Shin, Yudish? Or is it, as we tend to spell it, Aleph Yud, Dalad Yud Shin? So I have to check again what the first Sharblat that I could find that said on it Yiddish or Yudish is, but I would say last decades of the 1800s, or at earliest, probably early 1900s. And even then you have, I think, Chumash Beis Yehuda, often they would say it's an Ivri teitch. That was another term that was used a lot around that time, Ivri teitch. Different names of, so that itself, and we know in Rush, among Chabad, a nickname that was used often was jargon, which also gets at
used for translating of Chumash, not for the language.
Yeah, if the book was in a flowing Yiddish, they probably wouldn't use the term every teitch. But yeah, so this is you could study this and how these terms were used and what the terms represent, and the terms could represent conceptions of what the language is. So even calling it jargon is a bit dismissive. L'chaira has a bit of a dismissive. The Rebbe use it sometimes, but l'chaira has a bit of a dismissive connotation to it. I did find that in one place, so that Tzemach Tzedek discusses Yiddish, he actually uses the term Yehudis. Now, if you think about it, Yiddish is really an adjective. Yiddish just means Jewish, and in fact, here in America, you will find American Jews that will refer to Yiddish in English as Jewish. Oh, you speak Jewish. So, meaning Yiddish started off not really as a proper name, but as an adjective. Du first sich auf a Yiddische Eifen, und du redst auf a Yiddische Eifen. You're speaking in a Jewish manner. Like it was more of an adjective than a noun. And therefore, there are people that still have it in their head that like, oh, so if you speak in English, you say, oh, you speak Jewish. You're speaking in a Jewish manner. So I did find that in one place, the Tzemach Tzedek, or the person he's corresponding with, uses the term Yehudis, which is clearly a Hebraic form of that adjective, that, oh, that's Yiddishlich, that's Yehudis. But so it does prove that the term goes back a bit further. There's this extremely mini controversy that the Rebbe in later years used to comment that wherever it says Beis Lamed Aleph, Lashon Tevis, L'chayre, B'Lashon Ashkenaz, and Chassidus, the Chassidic works, the Rebbe said to call it B'Lashon Ashkenaz. Why be calling it that? Let's say it's Lashon Tevis B'Lashon Yiddish. And now Kahas, ever since then, whenever it says Beis Lamed Aleph, and they write a Ha'ara deciphering it, they write B'Lashon Yiddish. Well, the Chaykim say it's hard to understand what the Rebbe means because the term Yiddish was not in use till very recently. So you're taking the texts that are earlier, and they clearly still use B'Lashon Ashkenaz then as a term. So what's pshat? But at least somewhat from first of all, you could say that the Rebbe is not making a historical point. The Rebbe is, at this point we identify so little with Germany, especially in the contemporary sense from the last 100 years. They're like, we don't even want to call what we're speaking. We don't want to even call it Lashon Ashkenaz anymore. But even historically, it ties into this point that I'm making, that somewhere around the early 1800s, the Yiddish got severed from the German. So that means that when you're speaking, you're not thinking that you're speaking B'Lashon Ashkenaz anymore. You might still be using Rosh Tevis, Beis Lamed Aleph, because sometimes Rosh Tevis get disconnected themselves from their original. Like you only write it as Rosh Tevis. You wouldn't write it out as a full term. And you see, even like I see in the Rebbe Shab's letters, when he writes Ashkenaz in his letters, he only ever means like actual like Germany now, and maybe even the language of how they speak in German now. So they wouldn't call what they were speaking German anymore, essentially. Now, by the way, the vocabulary of Yiddish and German is still very very close and very shared. It also depends on which version of Yiddish you speak today, and I wanted to mention that at some point, how even today, there are different versions of Yiddish. You can have a lot more Hebrew mixed in, a lot less. There are, even in the last 150 years, people updated Yiddish with a lot of new German influence. A lot of new German influence was imported into Yiddish. So you could speak a version of Yiddish that would sound Hamish enough that it wouldn't sound like you're speaking German, but that a German speaker would say, oh, okay, this really sounds very, very similar to, like, I can understand 90% of what you're saying. I don't think they would say that about Chassidus Yiddish, which also has a lot of English mixed in at this point.
In my experience, that's more true of people who speak, I'm familiar with, let's say, people who live in Switzerland, in Zurich, which is a German-speaking city, and they have a lot of German words that are part of that they use in Yiddish, which, somebody who's not from Europe, maybe Antwerp also, the local tongue is also Flemish, which is also Dutch, but those are words that, a guy in Borough Park would not be familiar with necessarily.
So you're saying that even without an academic, like an active academic project, if you're adjacent to German lands, you're still importing new Germanic words.
When the guy from Borough Park says, like the famous joke goes, we crossed the street, he knows that cross and street are not Yiddish words. Whereas when you're living in a place that the local language is Germanic, it's a lot easier to stitch in new words, just like to happen automatically.
All right, that's very interesting. Just as a moment of levity, just to show how up to date I am on stuff that's going on online. Right now, there's a hit German song that became a meme. It's very popular. The whole chorus is just "Du bist gut genug." That's you're good enough. You are good enough. That's the song. That's the chorus, and it's being used as the background to all kinds of videos and skits. It's for those that are plugged in. You hear it a lot. So it already made its way back to the from world, and so you have a Chassidus guy online that has to do it. The Chassidus version is "Die bist git genig," or I don't know if they say genig or genug, but it's funny how the way the Germans actually say it is mamish identical to how it's completely not just mutually intelligible. It's identical. That phrase, at least, is literally identical in German today to what Yiddish would, if you said that phrase in Yiddish. Now, would someone in Russia 150 years ago have ever said such a sentence? Du bist gut genug? I don't know. Psi vocabulary, after you have to check. Did they use the words that way? And psi, the concept, I don't think they would ever tell anyone that you're good enough. That's a separate separate discussion. But just a cute example, mamash, from the last month of how after 100, let's say 50, 75 years, where it feels like Yiddish and German have really not been in touch with each other, and you could speak Yiddish your whole life and never think once about what do Germans say and what's the German vocabulary. You could be oblivious to the fact that Germans still speak German b'chlal. So it's just cute to see how German and Yiddish, for the first time in I don't know how long, reconnected, met each other again, and were reminded, oh, okay, Germans talk still pretty similar. So even with all the shinuyim, etc., they're obviously still very closely related. Yiddish is the closest related language to German, unless you want to start being mechalik within German-speaking territories that certain dialects are so distinctive enough that they should really be considered their own language within that context. Kufa, putting that aside, Yiddish and German are still, depending on how you speak it, 90%, 80, 70, whatever it is, they're still very, very closely related. And then the Havara will also affect, I assume that in this case, the way we speak Yiddish is closer to the way Germans would say that phrase. Maybe in other words, other phrases, maybe the way the Chassidus should say it is closer to how the Germans would say certain words. That's a whole separate discussion. Havara is beyond our scope here today. But it's just important to understand this evolution of how somewhere in the 1800s, Yiddish does get severed in that, Eastern Yiddish does get severed in that sense from German, where a Hamish Yiddish speaker no longer feels whatsoever that they're speaking Beloshen Ashkenaz. Like Beloshen Ashkenaz is no longer a meaningful way of describing how they're speaking, which is funny, right? Because we're defining it as Judeo-German. It goes back 1,000 years to Germany. So how to exactly, I guess we could think about what exactly that meant, that we're still speaking that language and we're speaking it because Ashkenazim speak it, but now we no longer identify with how it's spoken in Germany. Lamaisa is, as I just alluded to, Lamaisa right after the Tzemach Tzedek, as Yiddish literature started becoming a thing, Yiddish literature at that point was not considered very chashuv, and it wasn't a very lively, it was very limited to Torah stuff, to teitch and Chumash, etc. But as there was a push, an expansion in the types of literature that was being written, lav dafka by Yireim v'charedim with Dvar Hashem, but as time went on, even Yireim v'charedim also have expanded into other kinds of literature. So it turns out that Yiddish vocabulary was sort of poor. It didn't have a rich vocabulary, especially as the world is changing. The world didn't change that much for many hundreds of years, but in the last 200-300 years, the world is changing rapidly. German is obviously, let's take the English language. English language is constantly being updated very rapidly in the last 300 years. So same goes for German, obviously, in Germany, for German speakers. So Yiddish, if Yiddish wants to be a meaningful language, so Yiddish also has to be updated in some way. So that's where this term teitch that you mentioned earlier comes in, and that those that are writing Yiddish often tended to turn to German to fill in the gaps. If there's a word, a concept, a phrase that you don't really have the vocabulary, the words for it in Yiddish, so you can always just reach into the German dictionary and pull it out and just integrate it into Yiddish, and maybe you have to Yiddishize it to make it sound. If you notice the differences of what makes German different than Yiddish, so you can figure out, okay, so if I need to take this and from German and turn it into, I could do it right now today. I can go to the German dictionary today, take a word that's not, and sometimes it happens, comes up on chats. Maybe we'll get to this. People that want to speak Yiddish and they're actioning zich, I need a Yiddish word for X, Y, and Z, and there's no good word for it. So if you ask me, I think sometimes we should probably still go to the German dictionary and see how they say it in German. How do you say skiing on the slopes? So it came up once in some chat. I don't remember what the word was. But you look it up in Google Translate, you see how the Germans say it. If it sounds like it's built on the building blocks of the vocabulary that we know in Yiddish, it's just a chiddush of a term, a new term that's different than, it's not a term we would have come up with ourselves, why not still use it to import it? That itself is controversial. Among the Yiddishisten today, it's a puzzle, but tachlis, so besides the Chassidish world, there's a small pocket of Yiddishist, although it seems like it is popular among secular Jews or even non-Jews. It is like a popular language to learn. Sometimes it's like an anti-Zionist thing to like dafka learn Yiddish. So Yiddish does have its fans beyond the frum world. So among the Yiddishisten, it's like a puzzle azach to use German, so that you have to like invent words, but like it has to be without relying on German for whatever reason. And in the Chassidus world, it's already just showing like it's a weite Zach. What, you go to German and open, like we don't feel that connection. Again, weite, we don't feel that connection. It's not like we are like reconnecting with German. So what you see is that people tend to mix English in. And even back in Russia, as the world was changing, you see that even in Russian, even with the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe, depending on the context, they mix a lot of Russian words in where appropriate. So that's also important for understanding how Yiddish has evolved in the last 125 years. And this is to the point I want to make about, is Yiddish a live language or a dead language? If it's a live language, dafka a live language has to keep on evolving and absorbing new words. And sometimes those that seem, especially from Chabad, that seem to want to preserve Yiddish, ironically try to do so by trying to freeze it in place and only use Yiddish words from the dictionary or some arbitrary limit, which actually prevents you from speaking a normal, flowing, everyday language. In the Chassidus world, even though the stuff that you want to critique and what they do and how they do it, and if they're mixing too much English in or whatever, but to my mind, mixing in English where appropriate, maybe not 50% of the time, but maybe 10% of the time, or whatever it is actually the hallmark of a living language, and that's how Yiddish worked, especially in the last 200 years, where Yiddish had to evolve and develop to keep up with the times. And as that happened, if you look at Chabad Yiddish texts, you'll see how many Chabad Yiddish texts, the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe, have a lot of that German, that Deutsch mixed in. You can see within the Rebbe's own writings, the Frierdiker Rebbe's own writings, depending on the audience, depending on who they're writing to. But if you want it to sound formal, a Michtav Klali by the Rebbe, or other things like that, you could see how like the number of fancy German words shoots up. And I'm on chat sometimes where Lubavitchers who, they have a decent Yiddish, but they're trying to read the Rebbe's letters and they get stuck on these fancy German words. And whenever someone asks, I just show them that if you go to Google Translate and you search the German, you don't have to even use the Yiddish, you just search the German and you'll see very easily that it's a very straightforward German word, and after a modern German word, not a word that goes back 700 years, it could be it's 200 years or 100 years. So at least up until 75 years ago, there was this renewed influence of German. So even once we disconnected from German in that like we're not like going to reshape our dialect to sound German anymore, but there have been times where we have reconnected with German and it has influenced Chabad Yiddish, at least the written Yiddish, and even your vocabulary. If you're like a better spoken, a well-spoken Yiddish speaker, I think even the Rebbe, they said when the Rebbe would speak to women, the Rebbe used less Hebrew than when he spoke to men. So when you use less Hebrew, your Yiddish vocabulary sort of has to go up a bit, and the Rebbe's vocabulary does seem to do that. There are more Germanic words in the Rebbe's spoken Yiddish to women, in the Sichos to women. So there's a lot of interesting nuance here. That's when you actually want to understand Yiddish and have an appreciation or think about what kind of Yiddish you want to speak and think about it in a serious way. These are all very interesting and important components to what makes Yiddish tick and how Yiddish has worked in the last while. So like I said, we're sort of, I don't want to feel like we're just going in no particular direction. We're still going historically, which is to say that back to the Rebbeim and the early Rebbeim, so obviously they are speaking Yiddish, and obviously around this time Yiddish is more formally disconnecting. It's no longer lush and Ashkenaz in that older sense. And so like we said, they spoke Yiddish throughout all the generations. As time goes on, Rebbe Rashab, Frierdiker Rebbe, in the spoken and the written Yiddish, sometimes you have more Russian words being mixed in because they express certain things that there isn't a good Yiddish word for. And then as the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe start writing a lot in Yiddish, you see the different types of, or even speaking, there's different versions of Yiddish that could be spoken and written. Even the spelling conventions of Yiddish, when you learn Yiddish today, there are the rules of spelling. Where do those rules come from? So there were certain rules of spelling, or not fully fixed rules necessarily, but there were certain, like using an ayin for an S sound, etc., has roots that goes all the way back to the beginning, but not necessarily fully consistently. Or do you put an ayin? Do you put a yud? what exactly does it sound like to your ears? What exactly? So there was no standardized spelling in the way we have today. So that's the innovation of the Yiddish system. So already 100 years ago, you had Yivo in Vilna, where the main, they considered themselves the Academy of Yiddish and the guardians of Yiddish. Now Yivo still exists in some form, and they still consider themselves the Apotropos of Yiddish. So these spelling conventions, as we know them today, come from the Yiddish system, and clearly the Haredi world has adopted those, which is also interesting. If you think about it, you can see when he's writing to his family, he like writes in a totally different convention and like lots of yuds for chelams. There'll be like aleph yud yud azay, like aleph. I don't know. I think maybe like aleph zayin, aleph yud yud, or maybe I'm exaggerating, but that's like al derech zeh. That would sort of be the kind of spelling in the Rebbe's writings to his family.
Yeah, I think also sometimes it's hard until you have what's going on, that words that we consider one word are spelled as two, like farstein and things like that.
Right. Well, I mean, that gets to the building blocks of prefixes and suffixes, and that's its own topic. But yeah, so that would be part of a spelling convention. Do you spell it as two? Do you spell it as one? So lots of stuff that wasn't standardized before became standardized in the last 100 years, and now the Frum world mostly follows those. Although, weiter, there's a disconnect now where the Frum world doesn't know of Yivo. And if Yivo has an update to the rules, we're totally oblivious to it, and maybe we're taking the rules slightly in our own direction, etc. But at least 75 years ago, there was some kind of uniform standardization that penetrated and affected everyone, that everyone accepted one way or another. So like I said, the Frierdiker Rebbe, though, depends who he's writing to. Even the Rebbe, when he's writing to his shviger, Rebbe Senach Medina, I think his Yiddish there is a little different than the way it is when he writes to others, or later formally through the Maskiros. So there are all these different aspects of what's happening to Yiddish, and versions of Yiddish that could be spoken, versions of Yiddish that could be written. So back to the Mitteler Rebbe, though. Yeah.
Well, you bring to mind the question. Tell me if it's not the right time to talk about it. That's fine. But you mentioned how the Mitteler Rebbe published Chassidus in Yiddish. To the best of my knowledge, that doesn't exist by the later Rebbeim in Chabad. And then you have the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe spoke a number of times how part of the Frierdiker Rebbe's sort of Mesiras Nefesh and insistence on Afatzos Hamayonis was to print Maimorim in Yiddish, which was a break of protocol in order to accommodate the assimilating Jews in the United States in the 1940s. And then, of course, in our Doir of Chabad, you have, for some reason, which I'm not sure if anybody, I certainly don't know why, many of the volumes of the Likutei Sichos are published in Yiddish. So I don't know if you want to say something about
that. We'll try to throughout our talk. So back to the Mitteler Rebbe. So I want to go back to that, which is that not only did the Rebbeim speak in Yiddish, because that's the language that is spoken, but we find that the Mitteler Rebbe is the pioneer of translating things into Yiddish. So first of all, even in the Hanachas of the Alter Rebbe, or in the Kuntres Achrin, the last letter of the Alter Rebbe, it says Gewalt, Gewalt. So there's always, often in Hebrew writing, there's often a Yiddish word here and there. So you definitely have in the Memorial Chassidus, in parentheses sometimes, a certain word, a certain phrase will say Beis Lamed Aleph, however you want to teitch that ois, and then a Yiddish word or phrase. But we find that Mitteler Rebbe was the first one to more seriously, consistently, I would say, experiment with it, would be the word I would use. So we find that there's, first of all, this Bekeach Ivrim, which I said is really its own category, though. But even within Chassidus itself, Mitteler Rebbe took a minor of the Alter Rebbe called Mizmor Shel Yom HaShabbos, and sort of translated it and expanded it in Yiddish. And there's a few more, and these were printed, I would say they were relatively popular in the mid-1800s. Today you would only find that you have to look in the right sefer of Mitteler Rebbe's Mamarim in order to find it. But in the 1800s, we have, and you can look in Yitzhak Chachma, there's kaivetz from like the 1850s, the Chayat Tzemach Tzedek. They would print trace that had like a likud of like 4 or 5 inyanim from the Mitteler Rebbe in Yiddish. I don't want to get into the details of that right now, but you could essentially would be one thing I have in mind to do someday would be to like actually format it to show you like the Hebrew on one side and the Mitteler Rebbe's translation on the other side, and you can see side by side what the Mitteler Rebbe was doing. I Bechlal tend to think that the Mitteler Rebbe was the first Chassidus Mevuaris in the history of Chabad Chassidus. I think in many cases what he's doing with Alter Rebbe's Chassidus and the way he's rewriting it and expanding it, often Mitteler Rebbe is taken to be like dense and deep and complicated, and I'm sure that's certainly the case in some places. But in my opinion, this is also worthy of its own discussion. I think in many places actually the Mitteler Rebbe is doing a version of Chassidus Mevuaris where what's one line in Likutei Torah or a few lines that's like sort of jumping, you have to connect the dots. Mitteler Rebbe is filling in the gaps and writing it out in 50 lines. And the way it's printed, I think I'm very sensitive to how things are printed. So when you print things a certain way, what you're conveying to the reader is, this is a dense text. I think if you took a lot of Mitteler Rebbe's writings and you broke them up into paragraphs and you added punctuation and you gave it like a modern Mevuaris look, I think you would see, von sich allein, that a big part of it is a version of Chassidus Mevuaris. So I think Mitteler Rebbe was a pioneer in sort of experimenting with that and doing that in Lashon HaKodesh, a version of that in Lashon HaKodesh. But Akadei Kach is also doing a version of that in Yiddish. And I recorded a whole thing about Verstandig, I think it was last year, the word Verstandig. And I have to go back and check whether it was in what I recorded or what I found right afterwards. But I think it was even in what I recorded. I mentioned that I found that in Mitteler Rebbe's translations, at least in one place, I found the use of the form Verstandig. So that proves that was in the Chabad vocabulary, going back to the Mitteler Rebbe's writing. So that's an example of that, where you could actually even learn things about vocabulary from that. What's interesting is that when the Rebbe Kahas reprinted Mitteler Rebbe's Yiddish writings, speaking of spelling conventions, or the fancy word for that is orthography, the orthography was not kept. There was no fidelity to the original spelling. Yiddish, because there was no standardized Yiddish spelling until recently, so even from printing to printing, the spelling of the words would change. And also, I guess the idea was, if it's Yiddish, it's meant to be readable, it's hafatza, so why keep it in an archaic spelling once the spelling changes? So when you read the Yiddish stuff from Pekei Chivrim or others in the Kahas publications today, you're actually reading it in an updated version of Yiddish. You're not actually reading it in the original version of Yiddish that Mitteler Rebbe wrote. And I personally, just for my sense of historical accuracy, I like to track down and read it in the original. That to me feels like I need to hear the voice. When I read something, I need to hear, is it the Alter Rebbe's voice? Is it the Mitteler Rebbe's voice? When I read it with the changed spelling, it's hard for me to fully, properly hear and appreciate the Mitteler Rebbe's voice. So that's just my own hang-up. So I think that's an important point to emphasize. It doesn't get acknowledged enough. It's not appreciated enough. And I think I've said before, I think Mitteler Rebbe and the Rebbe have a lot of similarities. They're both very vivid and emotional writers, in my opinion. I've said this in different recordings about Chassidus and Mitteler Rebbe. So this is another Tzad HaShava, where Mitteler Rebbe is being Isaac in a version of Afatza, but with a lot more, I would say, a lot more constrictions. Back then, there wasn't that much room there wasn't a rich world of Yiddish literature the way there is today. The From world, especially Eastern Europe, was a lot more conservative about what you could write, what you could print. So I think there were much stronger constraints. And the Rebbe took advantage of new genres of writing, new styles of writing. So the Rebbe had a much wider room to work with. But I think the Mitteler Rebbe is the pioneer, and the Rebbe is continuing what the Mitteler Rebbe started. So the Rebbe is doing that to a much greater extent and spending a lot of time on it and translating a lot of things himself. Maybe there were some things that were translated by others. So there you see the Rebbe continuing that project of writing in Yiddish. And obviously at that time in the world, you had a huge number of people that only understood Yiddish and didn't understand Lashon HaKodesh because they weren't even necessarily from or fully from or whatever. So obviously, because Chabad has this streak of being mefitz things and making things accessible and meeting people where they are, so it's understandable that Yiddish was a big part of that, and that's all important to understand. Why then the Rebbe comes and gives a sikha and says, we're printing Shir B'Sefer HaTanya, we're printing it in Yiddish, and Yiddish is the language of Rebbe Seinu. It's not just like a technical zach, like, it's a zach ben Hashemayim, that the Rebbe said, Yiddish. No, there's like a very rich history. You study the history, you can actually appreciate it in a historical, meaningful way of the role of Yiddish, the place of Yiddish. And like I said, other Chassidish kreisen, despite the fact that they're very super into Yiddish, but they don't print Divrei Torah. It's rare to find formal divrei Torah of a Chassidish Rebbe that's written up and printed in Yiddish. I came across something in Netzer Chachma recently from like a smaller Rebbe that was in Yiddish, and it struck me like, oh wow, like seeing this, I'm realizing how I almost never see this. And this guf is a chiddush that they even within this sefer, which is mostly Lashon HaKodesh, there's 10 pages that are in Yiddish. If they do, meaning sometimes within the Chassidish Kreisen today, they'll print a gillion, they'll put it in the shul. If it's more of like a practical, if it's a Musar Sicha, they'll write it up in Yiddish. But like for Sephardim, it's the place of Yiddish is actually still, I would say, a lot more inferior in the rest of the Chassidish. Of course, they're printing. You go to their stores, they're churning out all kinds of literature in Yiddish, including stuff that's meant for men, guidance for life, or Musar, or is, speaking about a living language versus a dead language. It's clearly a living language, and that the amount of material that they're printing of all any type of material that's kosher within that world. They're writing and printing stuff in that style, and that's, to me, is the hallmark of a living language, which we'll get to our question, which is is Chabad Yiddish a living language or a dead language? So that's definitely one of the ways of gauging it and measuring it, in my opinion, especially with Chabad's history of using Yiddish. So as they mentioned in their conversation, the same instinct that led Chabad to use Yiddish is the same instinct that then led Chabad to pivot to English, because you're just trying to reach people where they are. So that is a chief and sometimes overriding consideration. But on the other hand, as we're trying to give better context for, Yiddish still is baked into Chabad, and everyone acknowledges that, and they acknowledge it in their way. You want to understand the Rebbe spoke Yiddish. So Yiddish is still a very important part of it. But when we talk about Yiddish and Chabad, the part of how we have to discuss it and evaluate and be honest with ourselves is to look for simanim as to whether it's still a living language, whether it's being used in real and meaningful ways, or it's on life support. So that's a point I want to get to back to towards the end. So that I think summarizes Yiddish and Chabad for the first 200 years, Lamar Zagan, of Chassidus. That gets us until the mid 1900s. I'm just looking here. I'll be honest with the listeners, those watching. I do have an outline here. I'm trying to keep to some kind of seder here. So I am referring to my outline here a bit, but nothing too complicated. So the next step really that we have to discuss is America. What happens in America? So first of all, obviously, there's two places where Yiddish goes to die. America and Israel. Each one has its own story and its own characteristics. We're going to focus here more on America because we're living here in America rather than on Israel. And Israel is more of an ideological thing, Zionism and Ivrit, and there were active campaigns in Israel 75 years ago to eradicate Yiddish, as is well known. You can look it up on Wikipedia. There was an organization that would march through Tel Aviv and bully people and fine people if they caught them speaking Yiddish. This is within the more secular circles. But even in the religious Zionist leaning circles, there was a lot of enthusiasm for dropping Yiddish and for embracing Ivrit. And that's obviously an ideology that I really don't have anything nice to say about. And I think there's a larger idea there of Zionism erasing those previous identities. That's part of what Zionism is. Even religious Zionism is, to a great extent, about erasing the Gaulish identities, and that includes the Ashkenazi identity, which is 900 years old. And this gets to a point that I wanted to mention earlier, and it has to be mentioned in different places, which is that part of how the Haredi world looks at Yiddish, looks at Menhagim, the way Ashkenazim look at it is that, like, Minig Ashkenaz, Kehilas Ashkenaz, is miyusid by G'dayli Yisrael. Even though we don't know exactly who moved where and who, as long as Ashkenaz is documented as a Kehila with Minhagim and Piskei Halacha and a language, it's been led by G'dayli Yisrael. Rabbeinu Gershom Hagayla, right? All the big takanas we attribute to or we blame on Rabbeinu Gershom Hagayla, who's 2 generations before Rashi. So that, whether or not every detail can be proven to be Rabbeinu Gershom or Rashi or whatever, when we look at it, it's like, wow, we have a way of life that's miyusid on the Rebbeinu Gershom and on Rashi and on the Rekeach and the G'dayli Yisrael. And that's why when Chassidim changed the Nusach, That was the Misnagdim's pushback. You're changing the nusach, it's miyusad by the rekeach, by azelche gedolim from the 1100s, 1200s. So, without getting into the nusach question, this is a way of life, a mode of Judaism that is 1,000 years old. And within the Zionist world, and even the religious Zionist world, there is definitely this idea of replacing these Golos identities with some kind of new Geula, however they explain it and define it, new Zionist identity. And as part of that, they are sort of knowingly, consciously deleting the Yiddish as a way of deleting that identity and replacing it with a new Zionist identity. So clearly, if you're a regular Haredi, etc., clearly I think that ideology is pretty foreign and problematic.
It's definitely still alive. I've definitely seen it. I can't tell you a name, but I've definitely seen that. Today, in the Frum Mizrahi world, there are leaders who are on an active campaign to eradicate Yiddish.
Absolutely. If you go online, and there'll be some social media posting about Chassidim, Yiddish, something, and you look at the nasty anonymous responses, you'll see people writing in Ivrit, Safar Glutit, disgusting language. There's like a hatred. And by the way, a lot of Jews that came out of Eastern Europe had a certain hatred for their upbringing, and it's a whole larger, unrelated to Zionism per se, or overlapping with Zionism and overlapping with other secular trends. There were Jews who just came out and felt that like everything about their childhood and their life back home was disgusting, and they associated Yiddish with a miserable life and a miserable existence and a street language, a prosta language, or whatever, or a very poor language that isn't good for expressing oneself in an intellectual way. Whatever, people came out with very negative feelings about Yiddish as well. So there were all these ideas where, these are a bunch of balls being juggled in the air and overlapping and combining and landing in different ways. So yeah, these are different attitudes people had to Yiddish 100 years ago, or even to some extent till today. So that's the Israeli story, but I want to focus more on what happened here in America, where it was less of an ideological thing, and just like in Chabad today, the loss of Yiddish is not an ideological thing, but it's gravity. For some reason, there's some kind of force of gravity in America that pulls everyone away from Yiddish. So to identify exactly what happened here is also, I think, important for this conversation. But also just to conclude a thought that I think I just started like a minute or two ago, part of how the Haredi world looks at it is that if we're following Minhag Ashkenaz or not, we're Chassidim, so we're half Ashkenaz, half Chassidim, but so much of the halach that we follow is Minhag Ashkenaz, etc. So like we're following a derech we spoke about this once about the Minhagim of Pesach. You're following a derech that's oisgetrotten by Gedolei Yisrael, and that includes the language. Even like the question of Shlashinu and Slashonim, how did they start speaking Judeo-German? But it was started by Gedolei Yisrael, so not a problem. The biggest Gedolei and Gedolei Rishonim, this is what they spoke, this is how they communicated. I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it was Oisgehalten. You want to say they even knew Baruchni, so this is whatever. We don't have to question it. Switching from that to Ivrit, which is a secular language, or switching to English and coming to America, well, this is the minig, this is the mode, this is how things are done in America. So as I want to get to, America doesn't have, the things we do in America are not oisgetrotten by Gedolei Yisrael. It's not like Gedolei Yisrael came here 250 years ago and said, okay, we came to a new Medina, decide to switch from Yiddish to English. That's not how it happened, as we shall explain. And even Ivrit obviously didn't happen in that way. It happens to be that if you live in a place long enough, depending on how much you action on certain things, you might just, by osmosis, by the force of gravity, you might end up speaking the local languages. But it's important to make that distinction, especially from the more Haredi you get. That would be how they would explain it and how they would articulate it. Something that's oisgetrotten by Gedolei Yisrael, or it's Stama Wildkeit. So what happened here in America? So first of all, what is the history of Judaism in America? So as we know, like I just said, the early history, the first 200 years or so of Jewish history in America is not one of Chashiv Kehilis, of Rabbanim, Gedolei Yisrael, with their Piskei Halacha and their Minhagim. That is not, we got off to a very poor start with Judaism in America. It was started off as like being the outside, you have the Western Sephardim communities of Amsterdam, of London, and it was the Dutch and the British that came and colonized, especially these parts of the United States. So some Western Sephardim came along with them, and then a few, I'm sure there were a few Ashkenazim in Amsterdam, so a few of those Ashkenazim haben sich mitgehabt and also ended up here. But you're dealing with people, those communities Milchatchila were like the most modern Orthodox, to use a modern term. Western Sephardic communities were pretty modern Orthodox by anyone's standards even 300 years ago to begin with, and they had Western Sephardic communities in Western Europe were based on Marranos that had come back to their faith, but it was already also a big tzimtzum there. It wasn't straightforward. It wasn't a Messiah of Yadus Sfarad. The Yadus Sfarad went more to the east, and this was not to belittle them. There were Choshve Kehillas at certain points in Amsterdam, Hamburg had big Rabbanim and Mechabrim and Menashe Ben Yisrael and others at certain Sfarim that are still quoted and read and respected. But definitely a much more modern community, even 300-400 years ago. So you're taking that community, which is already, you could say, in a certain sense, shvach, and also they were the first to secularize, the first to read the history of secularization. So like the earliest secularization, before Reform, before Haskalah, before anything, was Western European Jews in some of these communities were already going fry or becoming Eifkleret and becoming Koifrim before it was a major trend. That was the direction that society in those countries was moving already in the 1700s. So they were part of that. They were part of many of them were part of the upper class. You're taking that community and you're taking a shvacha slice of that community that's coming here without Rabbanim, without him. The only famous Rabbanim that came originally we know are to Recife in Brazil in the 1600s, when the Kehillah of Amsterdam created an outpost in Brazil. They actually did send Chashiv Rabbanim, and you have a whole set of Chachmei Recife by Rabbi Weitman from Brazil, put out a couple of years ago, a separate discussion. So it's interesting how in the 1600s they did have.
I'm not familiar with that sefer, but I do believe that Kehillah was the first time they addressed the question of when to say V'sein Talamato in the southern hemisphere.
Right, sounds right. Which is Dafka South America as opposed to North America, although I have to check where the equator goes exactly. I think with the Americas, the equator goes through like Mexico, no? Or through Central America.
Something like the United States is all in North America, so yeah.
Right. No, I'm just saying that because in Africa, sometimes you have to remember that North Africa is still above the equator. But I think with America, North America, and South America, I think pretty much South America is below. Yeah. So that was Neged Dafka to Brazil, because that was the first Jewish outpost was Dafka in South America. And that didn't last very long. The Spanish or the Portuguese recaptured it, and so they couldn't live as Jews anymore. They went back to Amsterdam. So that was a very short-lived outpost. But very interestingly, when they made an outpost back then, in the 1600s, maybe they were frummer, whatever it was, then they had that presence of mind to bring real Rabbanim over with them. But when it comes to the 1700s, the people coming over here are not bringing real Rabbanim with them, and there's no Chashve Rav, a real Rav, Baal Shir Kaima in America, till, I don't remember who the first one we could say was, but it's mid-1800s at the earliest, if not late 1800s. And by then... Just two more Mekaymas on this topic is, first of all, recently Mordechai Dinnerman did, I think, a couple of classes on things in the United States in the 1780s or 1790s, and also you did last year on the Yom Yom of Yudala Tammuz about Gulim and gravity and Chatzikad Elin and Tachtun. So you also touched on this history a bit. Right. 100%. And I don't know if we can have we can tie it in again, or we have the time. The more time we have, the more points we can connect. But we're already, I think, blown past the 2-hour mark, and so let's see how we land this plane. Hopefully within half an hour. So I think it's important to understand that there's no minig America in the sense that there's minig Ashkenaz. There are no gedolim and rabbanim that are coming to miyasid kehillas and setting a path of vizich tefidin, how to conduct oneself and how to speak and how to write. It's all the Wild West. Just as we know historically, even for the Nishid and Lahavdil, it was a lot of criminals, a lot of Lahavdil. Obviously it's 250 years after Mechabed, the founders that the very Chashva mentioned. To not to belittle and put down, there's this video going around now where the Rebbe tells Rabbi Waldman from Eretz Yisrael that Bechlal, you're not supposed to speak ill of Umas Ha'olam, you have to speak positively, so not to speak ill. But there was always this this reputation that a big percentage of the people that
Perhaps
came here are.
Perhaps you could say Baha'u'llah that they never there was never Judeo-English. They never wrote English in the Oisius of Aleph Beis.
So that's what I'm coming to explain. So I'm explaining how did Judaism get off? What's the start? How did they get off to the start here in America? So you're taking a slice of a Western Sephardic community that I'm not trying to belittle, and I respect all, and I'm fascinated by all types of flavors of Jewish communities. And Ad Yom Hazeh, there are some Western Sephardic synagogues that still continue the Western Sephardic rite, and they tend to be pretty modern Orthodox Jews in that way. But I'm very fascinated by, and I'm very respectful of how they do things. I'm not stam coming out a finstere kanoi. But Alpha Pikain, I think it's fair to say, I guess putting on my kanoi hat for a minute, I think it is fair to say that the people that came here we weren't sending the cream of the crop to, especially dealing with the Chatzi Katarat in a place where it doesn't have a Jewish history. There's a mamish nothing to, like, we didn't have that happening here exactly. And I'm sure some of the people that came here were Yirei Mishleimim, and they kept Torah mitzvahs to the best of their ability. And there is interesting, I'm fascinated by the early Jewish history of America. I saw recently there was, some Yiddish podcast did a video, and I didn't watch it, but it seemed like someone came on, and he's like talking about how, like, early American history, the Jews and their involvement and the revolution, and he's like saying we. I thought it's interesting when we choose to say we, because if you take Chassidus people, Satmar, or these Kreisen, they usually don't say we and include modern Orthodox Jews today in the we. So it's interesting a little bit how we're selective, how 250 years ago, Western Sephardic Jews that, like, we have nothing in common with, that's we. Now, for that we'll take credit. So interesting, the they versus the we, the shared identity versus different identity is a fascinating thing in its own right. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to say it's not we, it's they. They're very different from our communities. Like I said, I'm sure some of them meant very well and tried their best. It is a fact that intermarriage was very high among American Jews from the beginning. I actually looked this up again recently. It's not surprising, because that was the mode of American Judaism from the beginning. It was they were very assimilated to begin with. And they were hanging in there, and the Western world was not very religious, and a lot of the founders themselves were not very religious themselves either. Obviously depends which pocket of people, which group of people you're talking about, but certainly the upper classes were not super religious, many of them. And so intermarriage was an issue. It just came up in conversation somewhere about a certain early American congregation. Like in the early to mid 1800s, they added in their Takanas HaKehillah that they even accept intermarried families, intermarried children. And the discussion that I was seeing on some chat somewhere was this a Reform synagogue or was it not a Reform synagogue? So I said, this has nothing to do with Reform. Reform is a shita v'hashkafa to sort of legislate and, like, create a new Jewish constitution that overthrows the authority of Gemara. Like, formally, we're going to go and say Gemara is no longer binding, Shulchan Aruch is no longer binding. The Jews in America before Reform didn't need that. They were assimilating on their own in an organic way. So at some point, once intermarriage got bad enough, they just said, okay, I guess we'll, 50 years ago, we would have put our foot down and said, you're out. And now, if we put our foot down, how much is going to be left of our community? Reform isn't the right label to attach to it. It didn't come b'shem Reform. It's a dwindling, a diminishing state of Judaism, of Jewry, here in America, even before. Then once Reform came along, they said, oh, that's great. Oh, I think a number of these congregations and communities said, oh, that actually fits with how we're thinking. But you gave it a whole framework, you gave it a whole system. Oh, well, we're on board for that. But they were on that track before. So
I mean, it's really interesting to me. Like, I never thought about it in these ideas, but, like, the fact that Reform in America was so much more, to use the word, successful than it was in Europe until today. I grew up in England, and Reform was pretty much non-existent. It's like it goes back to the early days of Jews coming to America, and what was the matzav then, how Reform is received here versus how it's received in European places.
Right, but look, I mean, I'm not an expert on the 1800s history, but look, you have these Rabbi Marcus Adler, the Chadayma, who were also very modern Orthodox by our standards, but it seems like whatever they did, they managed with whatever shvacha version of Orthodox Judaism they had. It seems like you have to give them credit for managing to hold on to that and keep that in place, that it was watered down enough, but strong enough watered down enough that like it was able to not collapse, and people didn't just go on a stampede towards reform, but and strong enough that it's still meaningfully Orthodox, and that you can say that the rabbinate in England is Orthodox. I think it's you have to give credit for that, because it's not as I say in Ivrit, lo muvan me'elav. But I'm not, like I said, I'm not an expert on the exact trends as to what happened there. But yeah, it is a fascinating thing. Obviously, the Haredim in England and the Haredim in Australia didn't appreciate that modern Orthodox rabbinate. And after a certain point, I don't know how big Talmid Chachamim they were exactly. But yeah, I think credit is where credit is due, that they managed to keep that in place, because here in America that's not what happened at all. But like I said, there wasn't really a rabbinate here altogether. Maybe if the revolution hadn't happened, and ultimately the English rabbinate would have asserted authority over American Jewry, maybe the matzah would be a little better. I don't know. We're getting, but it's already beyond. We're focusing more on the. I think it's important to understand what set the tone here in America. So I mean, obviously there are even larger trends of what kind of non-Jewish people were coming to America and what the religious trends were among them as well. But without getting into all of the sociology, the Jews that came here were pretty schwach to begin with. Before they spoke English, they were speaking Spanish, in Amsterdam and in London. They were writing it also in Latin characters. They were the one exception to Jews always writing in Hebrew characters is the Western Sephardic Spanish community. So in Amsterdam, Hamburg, London, these places, they had a whole art scroll. I guess they were the first art scroll. They had a whole library of Sephardim, even Menashe ben Yisrael. Menashe ben Yisrael printed his books in Spanish and Latin characers. Recently, I looked it up.
For conversos or whatever.
As I explained, that whole community was based on these types of people who didn't have a strong Hebrew, including reading the Hebrew alphabet. So for the first time in history, this is 400 years ago, even my interest in the translations of Tanakh. So there was a Ladino translation of Tanakh, and in fact Ladino originally referred to specifically the translation of Tanakh, and then only later expanded to mean the whole language. So you have a Ladino translation tradition, and in the 1600s, it was printed in two places, in the East and in the West. In the East, in Turkey, it was printed in Hebrew letters. And in the 1800s, they continued reprinting it in Hebrew letters. In the West, in Amsterdam, etc., it was printed, there's the Ferrara Bible, it was printed in Latin characters. And to give them credit, it was not in a normal Spanish. It was like what Yiddish was to German, the Ladino was to Spanish, and to the Jews there, if they were more Oifikler, they probably read funny to them, but like they were keeping that tradition. There was like an oral tradition of how you teitch, how you translate the Tanakh into Ladino. And so it's funnier in a way when you put it in Yiddish and Hebrew characters. So the fact that it doesn't sound like the original language, that's fine. The alphabet makes it feel different. Here they were printing it in Latin characters, but it looked like a English, or it looked like, or it's very archaic, a lot of archaic words in it, whatever the case was. So it was printed in Latin characters. So they have a history of speaking, of writing Spanish in Latin characters, even Torah de Kesvarim, Menashe ben Yisrael. Recently it came up, there's always this debate, is it Rabbeinu Bechaya or is it Rabbeinu Bachya? So it seemingly never occurred to anyone before. I went and checked in Menashe ben Yisrael's Spanish works, because he quotes Rabbeinu Bechaya a lot. So how does he spell it? You can look in Latin characters, it's much clearer than in Hebrew characters. If I'm not mistaken, he writes Bachya. I have to double check, but I think it was Bachya. So it's actually a raya to the Choikrim, that the Taina that it's Bachya, not Bachaya. And that obviously Menashe ben Yisrael would have written it the way he heard it and the way he spoke it. So there's even if you don't even if you're not interested in the original Spanish for other things, but the small things like that, it could be negaya. So they have this tradition of writing in Latin characters because they're respectfully they're a little bit more assimilated, A, as being anusim, and then B, as the mode of the community that they set was a lot more modern, like I said, to use a modern term, modern Orthodox. So they come to America, and then obviously at some point they switch to English. So there was no tradition of a judeo-English, not B'dibur, not B'ksav. So from the earliest time that we have Jewish writings in America, they are written in English characters. And I was just looking on Friday at stuff from the 1840s, if I'm not mistaken. And there was the Occident, whatever, the different publications, those that are Bucky in the early Jewish English writings. It's all written in English, and where necessary, they would write the Hebrew words out in Hebrew letters. But there's no, that's who, if you want to know why there's no Judeo-English, that's the reason, as far as I understand. So they're the first ones that come. Then you have the wave of German Jews that come here. Those German Jews that come here in the early to mid 1800s, they're all Reformed Jews mostly. And Adi Yamazah, the New York Times is, which represents sort of that elite Jewish sensibility, American Jewish sensibility. Adi Yamazah, the Ox, I don't know how you pronounce their name, Ox, Salzburger, those families are those German Jews that came here in the mid 1800s. So Adi Yamazah, the New York Times, when people look at it as like this assimilated Jewish paper, it's coming from that crowd. So you have wave after. Then the Eastern European Jews start coming in the late 1800s. So they're coming to a place where, and right, they're also not originally coming with Rabbanim. They're also sort of the outer edges of the community, and it takes a long time until Rabbanim start coming. There are chaykim that say that the big wave of Rabbanim actually came after the 1920s. Dafka when the gates of immigration were locked in 1924. So paradoxically, rabbis had a lot easier to get in. There was more of a, based on the laws at the time, a rabbi was more of a good reason, of a basis. If a community brought a rabbi down, that was an acceptable reason. So all of a sudden, the ratio of rabbis to Jews suddenly started shooting up, because Pashto Yidden couldn't come anymore, and only rabbis could come. So the seeds of a more rabbinic-led community was, even though we think of it more as like post-World War II, the wave of Haredim that came then, but really the seeds were planted possibly in the 1920s. But until the 1920s, yeah, so some Rabbanim start coming slowly, but without getting into the history, without oversimplifying it, you have...
And there was somebody who came, and it was so bad that they went back.
Right, things like that.
Yeah,
is that the Ritz Baz? Is that an example of that, perhaps? Or
Chicago. No, but there were others also. There definitely were others also. I don't remember names right now, but there definitely were others as well.
So compared to Ashkenaz, where it's like we look at it, it's like, wow, the Gedolei Yisrael came and Miyaseh Kehillah. Here you have 200 years of the opposite of Gedolei Yisrael being Miyaseh Kehillah. The very most opposite you can think of. Like the last time you could find communities like this is probably like, I don't know, Greek Jewish communities like Bisman, like Churban Bayis Sheni, where you had like, entire Greek Jewish communities where like it's not clear how much rabbinic Judaism they were practicing, but they identified as Jews. I think you have to go that far back to find something like that, Ad Kadei Kach. So that's a big historical anomaly, and that's part of the whole Chatzi Kadrat Achten, like as I explained, and the anxiety of the Frierdiker Rebbe to come here to such a place, Nish Pashat. And Alpha became, somehow, the tide managed to turn, and America clearly has some kind of gravity that just pulls people away from religiosity, and even the Americans that want to be from Lahavdil, Lafi their religion, there's this crazy gravity that's always pulling at them. You have to like be very, very closeted and sort of removed from the population at large. The larger culture is very permissive, and even 200 years ago, even 250 years ago, it was very permissive. And America's andersh is not just Stama Piskam. We sometimes repeat it as like a cute Piskam. It wasn't Stama. It was like America was built on a certain yisoidus of freedom, not just in the positive sense, but the Freiheit in a more negative sense. And that was the mode of Judaism. So you have 200 years of Judaism that's in that mode, and everyone's speaking English, and it's you automatically are pulled into the culture. You follow the sports, whatever it is. 100 years ago, every kid was playing sports and following sports, and I was like a given all these things, watching the movies. It's all like 200 years of planting that not very positive from our perspective mode of living, even if you are from it, even if you are keeping the basics, but that's the mode of living Jewishly that's been paved here in America, which isn't great if you're coming as a Haredi, as a Chassid, and that's the life you're trying to live. So Alpha became enough critical mass was reached that to start overcoming that to some extent. But even then, we know the yeshiva boys in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, and even the 50s and the 60s, often tended to have, the American culture was a part of their lives, whether it's the sports or it's the movies, etc. You see that even the biggest Haredim, when they came here, that was a little hard to overcome. So at that point, to create a judeo-English was not a practical, realistic thing to do. And that's why there is no formal judeo-English, certainly not in Lashon HaKodesh Dika Oisius. So that's where we're coming from, and that's the force of gravity that's exerting its pull on everybody. So the yeshivish world used to teitch in Yiddish in their chadarim till like the 90s, till the early 2000s, and then at some point it's like, how can we continue doing? Like, we're not using it. Something about life in America pulls you away from speaking other languages. There are other pockets of, the Dutch. There's a Dutch Pennsylvania Dutch, whatever the exact term is. There are like these cute newspapers from 100 years ago where it's like newspapers in America printed in other languages. But we all know every group that comes here, you have Chinese newspapers, you have other, but the second generation, the third generation, you have the Hispanics that come here, and you have Americans that are very upset about Hispanics coming here, but the Hispanics' kids or grandkids don't speak Spanish anymore. After, after a day or two, despite what negative opinion you might even have about how they're not assimilating, Lamaisa, even the Arabic speakers after a generation or two typically do not speak Arabic. Even the groups that supposedly assimilate the least, there's something about America that's clearly so powerful. The culture is so encompassing and so pervasive. So unless you live mamish as the Amish and as a sect, that's the Amish talk speak their main language is like a different language. And even they all know English, and they also feel the gravity pulling on them as well. And even the Chassidus world, we talk about how the Chassidus world, the amount of English they mix into their Yiddish, to some extent, and I think we're seeing it also culturally, that the Chassidus world managed to close itself in for a certain amount of time, but even in the last 5-10 years, if you follow their music, you follow their culture, you'll see how much Americanism, it's like a marble. We used to, the term marble has been used, Tevas Noach. You mamish see how it's like penetrating from every side. It's hard to ignore, it's hard to avoid. So we're dealing with a real force of gravity here that Jews in Poland weren't dealing with 500 years ago, 400 years ago. Jews in Russia weren't dealing with 200 years ago. Once the Soviet Union came in, for example, that was a tremendous force of gravity, and very few Jews were speaking Yiddish. I mean, obviously there was the communists, Yevsektia, MS for a while, but at some point that disappeared, and that's another example of like a very powerful force. So these are historical anomalies. We have such a powerful force that like doesn't allow minorities to live as a pocket, as their own cultural pocket, speaking their own language for generations. It's practically, clearly impossible for sociological reasons here in America.
One question that comes to mind on this whole narrative. I'm just thinking, the Jews in England, so before the Girish, the Jews in England, I'm pretty sure, spoke French.
Right.
But post, when the Jews were allowed back into England, which I don't remember offhand what year that was exactly, and the first Jews who came and set up kibbutz in England after the Girish was the Spanish Portuguese. But what language were they speaking there, and why was there no judeo-English in England? Do you know anything about that?
That's a good question. I'm somewhat have like an online acquaintanceship with someone who was chaiker a lot of early English translations of Haggadahs and other things. I was once curious myself, since I'm interested in translation traditions, Jewish translation traditions of Tanakh. I wanted to know what's the early history of English Chumashim, Tanakhs. And the answer to the question about Tanakh is that the early Jewish English Chumashim were all just King James translations with like minor updates or ha'aris, on a certain word that, our Messiah is that we don't explain it this way, we explain it that way. It took a very long time till, there's another example of that, where take something like translation of the Torah, and those that lived in England in the 1700s, the King James Bible was so vital, even in England was so powerful, that like it was like a given that if you're going to print so the Jewish, what made it Jewish? It's Jewish is that you have the Hebrew on one side and the English on the other side. That's what makes it Jewish. The King James Bible has no Hebrew in it. That's the non-Jewish Bible. The Jewish one has the Hebrew on one side, like a Shul Chumash, you have the Hebrew on one side. You have the King James on the other side with some ha'aris, 1 or 2, 3 ha'aris per page on in Yonah Banid, that could be Meir on Lafi our Messiah. Because obviously sometimes the King James Bible translates things completely differently from our Messiah and our Havana. So yeah, even clearly within that world, whatever Rabbanim they have, we know there was David Nieto and the whole Maisa with the Chacham Tzvi and Teva. We mentioned the word Teva earlier, the argument over Teva. Even whatever rabbinic leadership they had here was not powerful and robust enough that whatever gravity there was within the Western European world generally towards secularism or modernism, etc., was pretty powerful even in England itself. And right, I said that even the Spanish they were speaking and writing was in Latin characters. So how are they going to suddenly come and write English and Hebrew? They weren't anywhere close to that kind of reality. So it's just at some point they switched from Spanish to English, and you could try to identify what door that was where English took over. But definitely in the 1700s, you start seeing British Jews printing small chiburim in English, or these translations of Tanakh, of the Haggadah, etc. into English. So that's already in the 1700s, and that's that. So England wasn't much better in that regard compared to America. So that's the history and the reality here in America, and we have to be clear-eyed and honest about that reality. And by coming here to America with all the word I used, anxiety, by coming to America, and clearly with some justification. So even though we say America is nicht andersh, that's in a certain sense, but clearly Chabad in America is andersh in some ways than Chabad in Russia. It's not identical. And there is an American character, even in Crown Heights, never mind to, even in Ali Taira, etc. There is the Arshinuyim compared to back in Russia. And certainly the more out of town, as we call it, you go, there's more and more influence of Americanism. And I remember many years ago, I used to ask myself, every Jew can sort of ask himself, what percentage American am I? How much of my life is occupied with American inyanim, whether it's cultural stuff or whatever it is. So people can give different answers to that question. The more Chassidus you are, that means that you have less influence of America in your life. The less Chassidus you are, so that gap, that void, is filled by being American. So first of all, by coming here, even though we say America is andersh, there is though a certain, we're conceding, we're agreeing, there is some kind of deal that we're making that we are going to be 5% American, 10% American, 20%, whatever it is, we are conceding that. There's also the very important point, which is that unlike other Chassidish groups that elevated every Chitzonistic aspect to a deraisa, so the lavush and the food and every small minig becomes like a deraisa. Chabad, we don't have that tradition, and that's connected to the Zionism Malbushim history. We don't have time to get into that. But it's also important. So where the Chassidish Adei Mazah, I remember seeing a chibur in Eichler's 20 years ago, a small chibur about how speaking Yiddish is mamash a deraisa. Why is it a deraisa? Of course, Lashinus Lashainam and Chukas Hagoyim and all of that. So turning it, we know the Hungarians, they love to do that, to turn everything into a deraisa. And we know also the Hungarians have a history going back to Hungary, because in the fight against the Reform wanted to speak Hungarian and or a proper German. And so part of the Haredi backlash was to make Yisurim into action. The Haredi Rav has to speak in Yiddish, Dafka in Yiddish, but that's Dafka in Hungary. So Hungarians are coming with that.
The Hungarian Kanos certainly traces itself to Chassam Sofer, which is really more representative of Western Ashkenaz, but okay.
Right, but the specific Yisurim date back to later, to Tafish Chaf, some famous Asifa, Tafish Chav Hey, Tafish Chavav, whatever it was. The different Chaim in Poland was also involved.
And when they came to delaying the Levayas or things like that, the Chassam Sofer was very...
Right, but I think the Chassam Sofer also he wouldn't have applied it, in my opinion, he wouldn't have applied it to every single thing those that came after him applied it to. He applied it to things in the Beis HaKnesses, Minhagei Beis HaKnesses, certain things that Reform were targeting originally. To expand it to Yiddish and things like that, I don't know if we can say that the Chassam Sofer would have gone that far, but they took it further, and that's from the Tafish Chafs. Now, Adi Mazeh, I know that in the Satmar world there's this idea of can you go to a Chabad shul or can you go to a modern Orthodox shul? What's the problem? Because the rabbi darshans in English. And Lafi, their historical memory, their historical conception, they remember that in the 1860s there was an Isser to darshan in the shul in any language other than Yiddish. So that's like the main issue for them in their mind. Like, can you daven? Can you go into a shul? There was in one of the Satmar Archivim a few years ago. It was like on the shar, on the cover, it said, "Can you daven in a Chabad minyan?" And that was like the shayla, like, can you, if you're out of town or whatever, and there's not really a proper Hamish minyan, maybe it's a new yishuv. The Chassidus are now returning to the roots.
I can tell you here in Chicago, there's a Yid, the line goes on to a great, very hush of Yid. Unger, he's bad some Polish. His brother is the Rebbe of Baba 45, but he's an Adam of Meislish, Weizsänerov, which is Hungarian, and in his shul, he's here already, I don't know, 30, 40 years, whatever it is. In his shul, he only talks in Yiddish, so now he already has a shtickle crowd who understand Yiddish. But there were times here that nobody understood him, but he spoke in Yiddish.
Right.
Like in private, he would speak to people in English, but his Shalashulus Torah and his drasha, whatever, in the shul only spoke in Yiddish.
Right. So, but if I recall correctly, in that the Kovetz Halacha from Satmar, I think that was part of the tshuva. Like, it said you can't, but like a big tainer was these kinds of, like, it wasn't getting into necessarily the Ashkafa and the Amunah and those things, but like the Chitzonistic Zachen, where like if you don't, we have our Takanos, we have our Gzeiros, and they have a Taikif of Deraisa, or we treat it that way. So they have this history of considering these things binding, where other communities, especially Chabad, Litvisha, Yeshivisha, don't. And Chabad and Yeshivisha are very similar, even though B'Hashkafa we're not so similar, but you notice B'Chitzonius, we end up being very similar. We end up both speaking English, a very similar style of, Yinglish as it's called. Our Lavush somehow evolved in very similar ways, the hat and the jacket and the kapata and the frock. So clearly, that's another example where you see larger social patterns where we're not coordinating, we're not really on speaking terms, we're not on the same page, at least begoloi, but yet like unconsciously we like make the same decisions in similar situations, and we end up with very similar things bechitzonius, in distinction from the Polish and the Ungarish Kehilas, and there's clearly more of an openness in this instance to bringing English in to some extent, although with some keeping Yiddish around in some form, right? So even in the Yeshiva Shavelt, the Rashi Yeshivas give the Shir in Yiddish. What kind of vocabulary do you need in order to give a Shir in Gemara in Yiddish? Not such a rich vocabulary, and the Talmidim can't really use. Sometimes you see in Mishpacha, not to call out specific publications, but in many English publications, when they quote a Yiddish phrase, they often butcher it. When they try to transliterate it into English, they butcher the grammar, etc., because they don't really have any basic sense of grammar and syntax. They have, they know 100 words, 200 words, whatever it is, but not enough to really get by. But there is still more of like I said, the Rosh Hashiva still speak in Yiddish, depending on the situation. A shir, a hesped, or it depends which hesped, etc. So it's interesting when you want to analyze Chabad, the yeshivish world is a very when you have a study, you want to have different groups. You want to have a control group. So it's interesting that the yeshivish world, I don't know if control group is the right zustand here, but the yeshivish world acting completely independently. It's interesting to compare the choices they make to our choices. So like I'm saying, we're working with a different set of values, and that we're not as extreme on these matters the way the Polish and Ungarish are. So that's also definitely a factor here. And as they mentioned in their conversation, I would say in my nusach, in my signon, they said the Rebbe places hafetza first. I would say it even in other oases sociologically, the Rebbe is rebuilding the Chabad community. I think the Rebbe consciously saw it as his mission to build and expand and strengthen the Chabad community in numbers. And in order to do that, we are allowing people, anyone who's interested enough that they are willing to identify as a Lubavitcher, which gets into the other podcasts that talk about Chabad identity, and who identifies as a Lubavitcher, and how do we decide who's in and who's out. So without getting into the precise black and white definition, if you identify as one and you join the community, that's usually enough to be counted as part of the community. Especially the more out of town you go, or even today in Crown Heights, at this point anything goes. So I think that was a conscious decision on the Rebbe's part, that we are an open tent. And as they mentioned in their conversation, it seems like other yeshivas, Chassidish yeshivas, maybe at some point even used Yiddish as a way of excluding. They wanted to actually start keeping people out. So you use Yiddish. If you don't speak Yiddish, you can't come into our yeshiva anymore. And Chabad, it's the opposite. We want to, in theory, we want to keep the yeshivas open and allow anyone to join. So that's a point that they made, which is definitely a valid point. But I would frame it as we want to build our community and expand our community as much as possible. And so that also overcomes the desire to be more conservative in some of these matters. So let's get to at this point, let's get to the bottom line, I want to get to the contemporary argument, the debate. Arguments on why, I have it written out, arguments on why to keep Yiddish. Arguments on why to keep Yiddish. As they said, and of course I would say in my nusach, there's 900 years of history, or 950 years, or you count all the Rebbe sichos, so it's almost 1,000 years of our history, our heritage, that is connected to Yiddish and embedded in Yiddish to some extent, especially in Chabad, where so much of the Torah is actually formally in Yiddish. If you're a yeshivish person, you could say, why do I need to know Yiddish? All the Torah that I learn is written in Lashon HaKodesh. Okay, so to understand the shit, it's different. If you're working with, what's your library? Their library doesn't have any important Yiddish texts in it. Although they definitely are missing out, even on their own, if I was speaking to a yeshivish person, I would say if you want to understand your heritage, if you actually, if you want your history to start 50 years ago and be disconnected from then drop Yiddish. If you want to be able to understand where you come from, really appreciate it and understand it, even if it wasn't the Torah that was being written in Yiddish, but so much of the newspapers, the literature, the Arum, 150 years ago, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, was in Yiddish. So if you don't have access to that, if you can't even read the text, and there's dargas here, it's important to distinguish. There's writing it. Writing Yiddish is the highest level of mastery. There's speaking Yiddish, and then there's understanding Yiddish, being able to read it, being able to follow a conversation. So we're not even talking necessarily about the higher levels of writing or even speaking. At the minimum, to be able to read it, understand it, to be able to be connected to your heritage. If you drop Yiddish, you could still identify as an Ashkenazi and keep it, but I feel like you are very disconnected, especially if you look in the Mariel and you'll see how many Yiddish words there are there. And okay, so you can read a translation. You're not really, to me, I feel like through Yiddish, I can go back in time, even 400, 500, 600, 700 years, and have a better understanding and Havana as to where we as Ashkenazi Jews are coming from. And because I understand recent Yiddish, I can build on that and understand Western Yiddish, medieval Yiddish, etc. Knowing English also doesn't hurt, because English and German and therefore Yiddish are also related, so that doesn't hurt either. So by dropping that, you are disconnecting yourself. And as they expressed it, and I can express it in my nusach, to be a proper Chassidish Yid, if you don't know Yiddish, I don't know if you can, call yourself we call him Chabad, Chassidus. Oh, is he Chassidish? Is he not Chassidish? I don't think it's possible to be Chassidish in Chabad without knowing Yiddish. Now, like I said, we want to be a big tent. I think it's very clear the Rebbe wants that we should be able to have a very big variety of people within our community that identify as Chabad, as Lubavitch in meaningful ways, and there could be seeing the Rebbe as their leader, following the Rebbe's major Hayros, etc., etc. But to be Chassidish, to use that word, the adjective Chassidish, I don't think it's possible to be Chassidish without knowing Yiddish. You can be very sincere, and you can try to get around the handicap in as many ways as possible. I don't think it's possible. And this is true for Americans, and I think it's even truer for Israelis, without getting into all of that. But there's so much coming out of Israel that in the name of Chabad that feels very foreign, and I would go even further than that. I don't want to get all negative here, but I think a lot of it is based on the fact that you look at the sprach, etc., the mode of conduct, the mode of expression, and it doesn't sound Chabad, it doesn't sound Chassidish, it sounds Israeli. Like it's like 75% Israeli with like 20% Chabad on top of it, as opposed to like where's the Hamish core, Hamish by Chabad standards. In order to be a proper Chassidish person and be worthy of having an opinion, be part of the discussion, to be a Deyazager, to have a valid opinion about the Yonim of Chinuch, about the Yonim of Hashkafa, about the direction we have to take. If you don't know Yiddish, I don't see how you could even be part of the discussion. That's my strong opinion. And whether or not the Rebbe said this explicitly or not, you could read it into different comments that were made. That, I think, is a very important point. And therefore, those that discuss about how maybe all our yeshivas should drop Yiddish. If all our yeshivas drop Yiddish, then you've essentially buried, there's an ecosystem. There are the starker ones, the more Chassidus ones, and then there are those that are, the Kabbalah, Chassidus, we talk about a tree, there's fruit, there's leaves, there's different parts of the tree, different parts of the ecosystem. To me, if you cut out the Yiddish, you're cutting out the shirish. So then we could all be, the terms we use today, Chabad light, or whatever it is, out of town Chabad, all kinds of terms that we can use. So that has to be stated clearly. And the conversation has to take, and again, I'm not saying that everyone has to speak Yiddish, at the very least, be able to understand Yiddish in a fluent, be able to read Yiddish fluently, be able to listen to Yiddish fluently. That's the argument I would make for Yiddish. Argument against Yiddish, or against teaching Yiddish, really, as they discussed in their conversation as well, is that it's tricky to figure out how to do this, especially with the force of gravity being so strong. So you're going to blame the parents. They say it's not really the school's job. Parents say it's the school's job. They say the Rebbe says it's not the school's job, it's the parents' job. In my opinion, there are a lot of parents that try their best. They try to speak Yiddish. In my opinion, this is my strongly held personal opinion, if you do not speak an idiomatic proper Yiddish, if you do not know the grammar, if you do not know the syntax, and you're just sort of translating from English to Yiddish with your limited vocabulary in your head, I do not really consider that a valid form of Yiddish. I do not even think it's a very good way of teaching Yiddish. I think it's almost, I haven't done a study. I'm sure it depends on the family, but my feeling is that a lot of families that try this, and often they try it for their first kids and they drop it by the next kids, I'm not even sure how much of a real impact it makes, and whether the outcomes as they grow up even really make a big difference. Chances are the parents, depending on the parents, but I think it would come down to more like the arum. If the parents are super Chassidish, regardless, chances are I think the kid will understand Yiddish better. And sometimes you have what we would call not Chassidish parents, but for some reason they have that thing, they're going to talk in Yiddish. I somehow doubt that trying to do that when the kid is 2 or 3 and speaking in a broken Yiddish to your kid is really even accomplishing that much. That's my personal opinion. And as someone who's sensitive to Yanam of language, to me, language has to be taught on a proper basis. You have to start from a proper understanding, a proper ability to speak the language.
You don't think that if parents, just a little bit of pushback here, you don't think that if you talk to your kid, so let's say you say du willst instead of willst du or whatever, yeah, you don't think that gives the kid a step up in when he's trying to develop the skills of being able to interact with Yiddish, that he has the basics from his youth?
Like I said, I didn't do a study. I can't prove. This is more of an opinion. I like to usually base things on facts, and this is more of a subjective opinion. And maybe it's just I'm just allergic to it. I don't know. Maybe I'm overstating, but my feeling is that you can't start on a krumma basis, and to me that's a very krumma way of starting. I can speak for myself. Where does my fluency, to the extent that I'm fluent in Yiddish, where does it come from? So I'm already 5th generation American, most sides, and already my grandparents were all born in America, and they already did not speak. I would say they didn't speak a fluent. I have grandparents Larichas Yamim. My mother's parents are still Larichas Yamim, and my father's parents are Aleim Shalom. So they were not speaking Yiddish as a native. They were sure they grew up with a million Yiddish speakers around them, and they could carry a conversation just fine. But they're already not native speakers themselves. They're already the children, the grandchildren of Yiddish speakers. So that's where I'm coming from. So my parents, they went to yeshiva in Flatbush. They still were teitching, and Yiddish was still a very big part of the environment. But let's say my mother, she does not identify. She doesn't speak Yiddish. It's not, she can read. When I was a kid, she could read a Yiddish book to me. She can, maybe read and translate, read a Yiddish and translate into English, but not a Yiddish speaker by any means. My father identifies much more that he's able to speak Yiddish, but I did not grow up around him speaking Yiddish. He says he conducts conversations with Chassidish people in different environments, and he carries himself very well. I did not benefit from that. I didn't get to see that, so it didn't influence me. So, based on that trajectory, I would certainly not be able to speak Yiddish, and not even really I shouldn't be able to really read and understand Yiddish very well. But I went to Alei Torah, and in Alei Torah, the Seder was in P1A, they teach basic vocabulary, and I have like a vague memory even in P1A, like they had, a picture of pants, and it said Hoizen on it, or whatever. And as far as I understand, my basic vocabulary came from P1A. And then in first grade, you come to Yeshiva, you start teitching. So from the vocabulary in P1A and the teitch in first grade, as far as I understand and remember, that is where my Yiddish came from. Now, maybe I'm slightly above average in that regard, because I think by first grade already I was reading Yiddish books fluently, and I was a big reader, and went to Alei Torah, and there's no limud yichol, there's no English. So you have to be able to read, and as they said in their conversation, you can't be illiterate in all languages. So I naturally was able to become very literate in Yiddish and read it very well, and I've been doing that ever since. I don't fully formally identify as a Yiddish speaker because I did not grow up around a living tradition of spoken Yiddish. So I can string sentences together, and depending on whether you catch me off guard or whether I'm in the mood, maybe I can even string them together 90% well, but I actually do not identify as a Yiddish speaker because I do not consider myself able to speak a fully proper native and idiomatic version of Yiddish, and therefore I don't think that really counts. And this Sikha of the Rebbe, the famous Sikha, Tav Shemam Chesed, gets quoted, and they quoted it. The Rebbe says, Spitz Chabad, they come and they're talking in English, their parents spoke in Yiddish, and the Rebbe spoke in Yiddish. When I saw that Sikha when I was a Bacher or whatever, my feeling immediately was that Sikha already is talking about a different generation compared to my generation, because people that are in their 40s in Crown Heights, Taka grew up, 40s and older, Taka grew up in a different environment where Taka was a lot more Yiddish around them, and if they just wanted to, I think they could have picked it up a bit more easily, and they could have spoken it a bit more fluently. But the next generation, people that are born even, so you have people that are in their 60s and the 70s, till today in Chabad, you have people in their 60s and higher, that even if they're American, they went through the full American system, but they still speak, if you actually get them to speak Yiddish, they can speak, I would say, a pretty fluent, native, idiomatic Chabad Russian Yiddish. LMI, they didn't speak it at home, etc., etc. They didn't pass it on to their children. That's that door. The next door, they are not quite in that madrega, but like the Rebbe said in that Sikha, their parents, they definitely heard their parents or their grandparents speaking it, they heard their Rosh Yeshiva speaking it, etc., etc. And if they wanted to, and by the way, back then, you actually had Aliternics that came out in the memes, even as late as the memes, who never really learned English properly. Like Leitaka didn't learn English properly. Today, when I grew up, everyone picked up English and reading English and writing English by 7th, 8th grade, whether they had tutoring or they didn't have tutoring. It was almost unheard of to not know English. But if you look at slightly older, the people in their 40s, there are some, like they say, they came out, they were 20 years old, and they couldn't read or write English. So it was a different environment then, even if they were speaking English at home, and even if they were speaking English to their friends. And that definitely gives us a leg up, and why Alei Torah doesn't have to teach English if you want to say they don't have to, because we pick it up by osmosis, because the gravity around us is so strong. You could pick up English without ever even learning it formally. So that is clearly even more powerful today. And back then, you had some that came out and like they didn't know. So Avzeh is a shtickle taina. You could have tried a little harder. You could have tried to speak Yiddish. But for people in my generation, I think it's sad. It's a little pathetic to try to speak a language that you don't really speak. You can't really speak it properly. If you wanted to learn how to speak it, you would have to create a real comprehensive teaching program, which is not clear whether the Rebbe holds, because teaching Yiddish is like a Yiddishist thing. It's like teaching Hebrew is a Zionist thing, and teaching Yiddish is a Yiddishist thing, and our Chadarim are not language, they're not intended for teaching languages. It's more of a secular thing to do. So there's that aspect to it as well. So it has to come by osmosis, and like they said in their conversation, if you start a kindergarten, start in P1A, and you introduce it, so at least someone like me could pick it up. The problem is that not everyone in Alei Torah is picking it up to the same degree. So 40%, 50%, I'm Baruch Hashem, I already have children. In my mind, my plan was to do the same thing. I was hoping that they would pick up the Yiddish, and it's important to me that they pick up Yiddish, but in the same way that I picked it up. I don't care if they can speak it fluently or not. It's not so I never tried speaking it at home, etc., etc. That was my attitude and approach to it. So far, it seems to be working just as fine for them. They learned the vocabulary, they learned the teitch. Maybe now in Alei Torah, some Rebbes translate in 3 languages, which the Rebbe said out of town is not such a good idea. But even
it's
though
interesting. I'm just thinking, like, Okay, first of all, for me personally, I did spend 2.5 years in a cheder in London where the language was Yiddish, so that's, I mean, pretty much where my Yiddish comes from. And till today, I mean, I have a regular chavruso I learn with who basically we speak in Yiddish. Once in a while, we'll throw in some English words, but yeah, but like I did not end up speaking Yiddish with my kids, even though I did want them to have. Whatever. I mean, even my oldest son, he can sort of break his way through a sikha in Yiddish. I don't think he would be shaykh to reading a storybook or a magazine in Yiddish. And again, I think that is Chicago out of town or not, can done sein, but certainly that's a part of it.
Oh, so that's the idea, which the Rebbe is identifying even 70 years ago. That out of town, it's not going to work out of town. I think that makes sense. But now there are voices, within the community, but even like among, more spitz, there's a Rebbe, I'm not going to say his name, was a Rebbe in Alter for many years. And teitch was dafke his thing. I'm not going to be meidich. But I spoke to him recently. I reconnected with him. He was my Rebbe when I was a kid, and I got interested in teitch, so I connected with him. He was telling me that when he sold the Rebbe's minus already 30 years ago, he came to the conclusion that the Rebbe holds that you should only teach in Yiddish the kids who speak Yiddish, and you shouldn't teach in Yiddish the kids who don't speak Yiddish, because then it makes it difficult for them, and they have a bad fit. So Mamela, he had come already 30 years ago and tried telling them in Hala that you have to abolish Yiddish, abandon Yiddish. This is his opinion. And they weren't having it, and at some point he realized that what's the point of just antagonizing people? So he gave up. But in his mind, that's still the Rebbe's shita. And I say it doesn't even come down. I don't need to be medayik and minus and have that whole discourse. To me, it's a davar pashut that we cannot abandon Yiddish in the flagship Yiddish-speaking yeshiva. Maybe as they mentioned in their conversation, if you think your child is suffering from the Yiddish, so there were two yeshivas. You can go to the English-speaking yeshiva, or you can go to the Yiddish-speaking yeshiva. But there has to be a core of people. There has to be at least whatever it is, whatever percentage it is of the whole Chabad or percentage of Crown Heights, etc. There have to be people that are full-fledged Chassidus Lubavitchers, and I think it's a given that if you are lacking that, you can never be a full-fledged Chassidus Lubavitcher. You have a lot of milas, and you are 70% there, whatever it is, but you can't go all the way. So to drop that is in my opinion, is mufrach legamre. And like I said, we don't have to even strive for the speaking. It's not even necessarily important in my opinion. At this point, the speaking, in my opinion, I'm going to probably entitle the video, is Chabad Yiddish dead? I would say that functionally as a living language, as a living spoken language transmitted from generation to generation, I would say it's mostly and practically dead, and I'm okay with that. That's just the reality. But Jewish Aramaic is also dead, and it's been dead for 1,000 years, but we all study Gemara, and we learn the vocabulary for the Gemara to be able to make a laning well enough, and no one has to know how to conjugate a verb and a phrase in Aramaic, and none of us can. And if we tried, we'd all make fools out of ourselves. And if you knew Aramaic, even in the Rishonim, Ashkenazi, we can blame it on Ashkenazi, we're always shvach in diktuk. Those that know Aramaic diktuk, they pull their hair out whenever they see any post-Talmudic Aramaic sentences, because they almost never are like fully grammatically correct. And okay, that's okay.
There's a Batchan who has a piece where he says, I ended up in Padan Aram. He has a whole conversation of kids playing sports or whatever with, in Aramaic.
Right. So, we don't have to speak Aramaic, but Aramaic is yet Aramaic is a very important part of our learning. It's still in the Siddur, it's in all these places, and we get by. We read the Erev Tavshilin, and we say L'adluke Shaga, and we understand more or less Vashtet, and it's okay. So, Aramaic is dead in that sense, but it's still very much alive.
Jetzt bist du Taka bis lang gezogen.
No, I'm fine. So, and that's perfectly fine, and that's okay. Obviously, like I said, it could be Aramaic was replaced originally by Gedolei Yisrael. We don't know exactly how they stopped speaking Aramaic. I don't know if Gedolei Yisrael gathered together and said, okay, from now on, we're going to... It's hard to say exactly what happened, but at some point it was dropped. It clearly couldn't survive anymore. The conditions weren't in place anymore for it to continue as a living language. And even though the Targum is in Aramaic and Shnai Mikveh Echad Targum, it's a whole Tarachion, so we're doing Shnai Mikveh Echad Targum with A, we don't even use it in Kriyas HaTorah anymore. We're not Targum Kriyas HaTorah, and B, it's like who understands the Aramaic of the Targum? But that's it. Most people, when they do Shnai Mikveh, they use the Targum, and it's a big part of our lives, and we manage one way or another. And of course, I'm very interested in Aramaic, and I like to study Aramaic the way I study other Jewish languages, and especially the Targum, to understand what the Lashon Targum is and Lashon Chazal is. It's a very important thing. But we don't have to speak it. So I do feel that at this point, obviously there are pockets, like I said, there are 67-year-olds, and maybe there's a mishpacha here that still keeps it, and a mishpacha there. But that's not whatever the academic definition of a living language is. I don't think it rises to the level of a living language, and that's mostly okay. I think there are things we could do to strengthen it. If someone was asking me eitzes, or someone gave me a budget of things and asked me what we could do, I would give suggestions. I think one thing is, like I said, to really try to avoid speaking an ungrammatical Yiddish, and even in the yeshivas when they write Yiddish things on the signs, or they write Yiddish publications, I see the Yiddish and it really bothers me. People don't even have a conception of what the grammar, they don't even realize that they're not grammatically correct. Like there's 1% of Chabad still could be magia, a Yiddish text, to make it grammatically correct. So, and 95% of the people don't even know that it's not grammatically correct. They wouldn't even know to ask a magia to be magia. If you're writing something in Yiddish and publishing something in Yiddish, I think it has to go to magia to make sure that it's. The Rebbe, of course, Kutasichas, it had the big name in the Kutasichas for many years was Dubrovsky. He was like the big literary Yiddish expert in the Lubavitcher Hoif. And
by the way, you're reminding me that sometimes. So the Kutasichas Yiddish is always spelled according to the Yiddish conventions, but once in a while you'll see words that are not, like, according to the convention, the word M is spelled Aleph Yud Mem, but once in a while you'll have Ayin Mem, or you'll have Chotch spelled with a Ches or a Chav. So apparently all of those anomalies in the Kutasichas are Hagos that the Rebbe made, and they left it the way the Rebbe spelled it. So that means that in the Rebbe's personal pen, he wasn't necessarily always sticking to the Yiddish spelling conventions.
Sure, yeah. That's a vart that I learned, whatever it was, 10, 12 years ago. And once you learn how to identify it, you start noticing it. And also, Ha'aris and Lashon HaKodesh, you can see when there's like a bunch of hyphens and something's going on. You could tell usually that they copied the Rebbe's Hagah straight in. But yeah, absolutely. But otherwise, besides for that, I think Dubrovsky was the big expert that made sure that the Yiddish was sound, lefi all the klalim bechlal, and lefi the Yiddishistish standardized klalim. So that's very important. So that's number one. I think ungrammatical Yiddish is just very harmful. That's just my personal opinion. Another thing is that you need to have publications. You need if there's a culture. There's people read things. People listen to things. If you want to seriously keep a language alive, you have to invest in the culture, even though it sounds a bit secular, but you don't have to say it in secular words. Lamaisa, throughout from the Tafshins till Tafshin Mams, it was Shmuzim at Kinder that was printed both in Yiddish, Shmuzin, and in English, Talks and Tales. Was it printed in Yiddish in order to preserve the culture of Yiddish? I don't know if that's the reason, but they definitely continued printing it in Yiddish long past L'chaira when it was even necessary to still print. Like in the 40s, you could say, look, there's a percentage of the kids that might prefer Yiddish over English. But at some point, unless it's for Olitarniks, but was Shmuzin in Yiddish just for the Olitarniks? I don't know. Maybe either way, we see this idea of there was reading material that was being printed in Yiddish, and a proper Yiddish that for kids to read. And in my home, Shmuzim Kinder is archaic, it's antiquated at this point. I would suggest if someone took the initiative and not just reprinted it in new binding, but maybe was malakit different types of articles and printed them. The Tzel Mir Amaisa when I was a kid was a version of that where you had just like some of the longer stories. But maybe the other parts as well. If it was reformatted in a contemporary format and printed, maybe that could contribute. Personally, in my home, I growing up as a kid, I read a lot of just whatever the Chassidus world. The Chassidus world has a very living, vibrant world of publishing. Like I said earlier, all kinds of things for kids as well, and very vibrant. The amount of things they're publishing, could be its own conversation. The variety of things that they're creating and publishing. Obviously, their Yiddish is different, and we look down on their Yiddish. To us, it's an inferior Yiddish, etc., etc. And even in their writing, maybe they mix some English in. But to me, growing up, I don't know what my Yiddish would be if I wasn't filling my mind, immersing myself, not just in the teitch and the cheder, but also in reading hundreds of books. And I give my mother credit. She used to go to all the libraries and borrow as many Yiddish books as she could from every library, and went to different libraries around town to get me as many Yiddish books to read. And every week I went through another book and went through hundreds of books this way. And now with my children, first of all, my mother, she still is involved in that way, and she takes out books for the older children to read. Now today there's a lot of comics, which I don't really hold of either, but the kids today, they usually start from comics. It's usually the entry point, because kids like comics, so that's a way to actually catch their attention if you have comics. So there are some Chabad comics in Yiddish, which I think are of, I could say they're of a somewhat low quality in various ways, but it's not enough. If you want the kids to read a book every week, and there aren't hundreds and hundreds of Chabad Yiddish comics or Chabad Yiddish books that are being printed, that's just a reality. So, in my opinion, even though some people are very conservative, what they bring into the house, they want the kids to only read Altaras Chabad, you got to pick and choose. And also, there's the debate that they got into a little bit as to, do you want your kid to be intellectually developed, or do you want them to be stunted? And it was a cute thing they mentioned there in the conversation about how even like whatever it was, however many decades ago, you had two voices in Chabad work. Of course, you have to teach them how to write. They have to know if it's Yiddish or Lashon HaKodesh, has to be one of those, but they have to be able to write and express themselves. And then there's like the version of like, no, they don't have to know how to read, they don't have to know how to write. They have to be Chassidus Yidden, and they have to write a pan for the Rebbe, and that's it. I obviously strongly identify with the, you could guess which one I identify with. And therefore, in my opinion, I don't think, we don't see from the Rebbe as a conservative, like, to bring other books into I don't see that coming from the Rebbe. So in my humble opinion, if you want your kids to really interact with Yiddish as a real language, you have to bring in non-Chabad Chassidus stuff that's being put out up to date in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And there's a ton of stuff, and that way you'll have books and books for them to read every week. And even the magazines, I bring, I'm not going to give free advertising here, but one of the magazines that comes out that it's a package. It has a children's section. It has like a Yiddish version of Mishpacha, essentially, like an adult, like a full-fledged magazine with interesting articles for adults. They have a section of pictures of the Rebbe from the Rebbes and the Rebbe from the last week. They even put in news from the Shmira and the Shomanim of different communities. So there's stuff in there that there's breaking news, national news that I wouldn't bring into my house. I don't talk to my kids about national news, and they get it a little bit from there. There's updates about crimes, pictures of drugs, pictures of weapons that I would not bring into my house. Stam Azoy, and it comes in Azoy through the back door, dafka from the Hamish Chassidus publication. Okay, no, sure, that's a sacrifice that I feel I have to make, and I think that when I see that my kids are reading that, then I feel that, oh, okay, I'm being successful and conveying Yiddish to them the way it was conveyed to me, and now Yiddish is accessible to them, and hopefully, obviously, they're still growing, and the Rebbe is all helpful that they should backside the way we want them to. But the odds that they will be able to engage with Yiddish in a meaningful way, including on a learning level in Sichos, are that much more higher because they are engaging with it more consistently in an intellectual way, stimulating their mind. And also today you have videos, by the way, I didn't grow up with this, but today you have all the Intidins and the Ibidins and all the Yiddish plays. And those are actually popular. Interestingly, they're actually popular with all kinds of Chabad kids, even those that are not like super into Yiddish per se in their home. They don't have like a shita to bring Yiddish into the house. But it's interesting enough, and it's kosher enough, that if you want to bring kosher entertainment in your house, that's another form of kosher entertainment that involves Yiddish, and it's okay, it's a different havara and all that, but if you have a kinyan, if you learn a little Yiddish in yeshiva with the teitch and this and that, kids do seem to be able to learn it and be able to follow it. So that's in my opinion, if you want to approach it seriously and realistically, this is, am I going to blame this all on the Rebbe? I don't have to blame it all on the Rebbe. I don't think the Rebbe has to micromanage these decisions. I think we're allowed to make individual decisions in our homes on our own. We don't have to have someone pulling the strings in every little decision. And this is what I think worked for me, and I think Amias Hashem will work for my children. And that's what I would recommend to anyone who wants to go down that path. All the other ideas of Rebbes that claim that they can get the class speaking Yiddish, first of all, I would have to evaluate the claims for myself and see what the outcomes are, in my humble opinion. Secondly, it's very hard to scale. Even if one Rebbe could do it, it's very hard to scale it and get other Rebbes to do it. It's just not, it doesn't seem like a practical plan. But I think we need to have a flagship yeshiva that keeps the Yiddish. That's a must, in my opinion. And starts in the vocabulary in P1A. Whatever the Rebbes can talk or bring it into the conversation or whatever as best as they can. And the teitching. And in my experience, the kids do pick up. And as a parent, sometimes when a kid teitches something, if I hear my kid and they teitch, I'll make sure. Okay, and what does that mean? Just to make sure that they're not just parroting the teitch without understanding. But that, to me, the teitch, like I said, is historically and for me personally a big linchpin of being manchil Yiddish to the next generation. So that's my practical take. And I think, like I said, without being medayik and minus, and I don't know if it's necessary, I think it's very clear that the Rebbe would never agree that there should be a heiche timtza, a metzias, where Yiddish just becomes extinct and we stop teitching. The second you stop teitching, Yiddish is completely extinct. And I do not think the Rebbe would agree to such a thing, especially considering the Chassidus of Yiddish. And like I said, the Rebbe didn't, even Oli Torah, they were talking in their conversation that we don't have any really clear minus on the record, one way or the other, in a hair. One thing I would say, that this is my own personal opinion, is that if we wanted to try to create our own version of judeo-English, right? So two things. Number one, I would taina that, let's say your kids don't know Yiddish, or even if they're in Oli Torah, and let's say they're not on the path of really understanding Yiddish very well. In my opinion, is a strong tzad to say that you could teach them English, and it's not a problem, and it's not limudei choil, and this gets into my whole recordings about the gut of limudei choil. In my opinion, it's the kavana. It's, are you teaching them English because you're trying to put them on a path of education, of higher education? I would say in today's day and age, if your kid is not going to be a Yiddish reader, realistically, and you want your kid to be able to read and absorb Jewish literature, most Jewish literature printed in America now is in English. So if you want your kid to read art scrolls or hachais or etc., Chassidus children's books, so you can teach them English with the kavan and gans l'shem shamayim, that I want them to be a better Jew, and this is the Jewish language in America. For whatever reason, it's not in Hebrew letters, but it's in Goyish letters, in Latin letters. But l'shem shamayim, I want my kid to be a kosher yid. I'm teaching them English for that reason. I think at this point, English has become enough of a Jewish language that I would be willing to make that argument. On top of that, if you want to let off the milsa, I would say I think there's a stark svara to say that there is room to experiment with creating a proper Judeo-English and creating a spelling, using probably Yiddish spelling conventions and figuring out how to convert that to English. Obviously, there's certain consonants in English that might be harder, the j sound or whatever. You have to figure out how to do it. But the reality of in Oli Torah, for example, is that the kids are speaking English or Judeo-English, which is 70-80% English with some Yiddish and some Hebrew mixed in. So it's not that hard and that difficult if you just put your mind to it for a couple of days, a week, a month, to create a Judeo-English. And if they wanted to print something that more kids in yeshiva can understand, if they printed something in Judeo-English, every single kid in Oli Torah would be able to read and understand it and appreciate it. And there's no reason why not to. You're certainly not teaching them English, l'kol hadeis, because you're not teaching them, you're not helping them become a better citizen by teaching them Judeo-English in Hebrew letters. So there's no chashash limudei choil, in my opinion. And I have argued that over time, even with the whole history that I gave of English in America, Judeo-English is, or to some extent, minus the Hebrew letters. If you take away the Hebrew letters issue, there is a language of Judeo-English that is a language that's already spoken by, either if you're in the yeshivish world, by Gedolei Torah, or at least by Chashiv Chassidim, etc., etc. And even the Rebbe, as we know, did speak in English sometimes. So a certain percentage of the Rebbe's sichas or output is in English. And today now they're printing the Rebbe's letters in English, and you have the Spitz. I saw a few Spitz voices on the chat saying that now all the Israelis have to learn English. The Rebbe sprach. Look at all the Rebbe's Torah that's going to come out in English. Okay, I'm not going to go akadekach, but English is clearly, when we speak about Judeo-German, we speak about Yiddish as being embedded in Chabad's Torah. So at this point, English and Lashon HaKodesh, obviously, but English and Ivrit to some extent, but English is also a certain percentage of the Rebbe's Torah. So that's another reason why, at least if you're in America, you're in Torah, you can teach the kids judeo-English. I think it's, in my opinion, it's in a different gather now than it was 60 years ago, 70 years ago, where it was like, Stam, why do you need it? Clearly we're in a different place right now. So I also would argue that there is room for discussing that and having that conversation about that, a little out of the box, but I think it's valid and is worth discussing. But like I said, even in terms of Yiddish, there's a lot more that could be done to make it more living, more immersive, and the different teitches, the things to avoid. The ungrammatical, non-idiomatic Yiddish, I think, is not helpful, and I think there are either bring in the outside material or work on creating our own material, whether it's bringing back material from the shmuzin that no one is looking at anymore, to make it relatable, to make it formatted in a way that people would appreciate it, or to figure out, to get gabzechanetza and to work with the Chassidus publishers or whatever it is to, you could take the Chassidus publishers material and have a Lubavitcher Magia who actually knows the proper Yiddish, be Magia, to take out their spelling and their vocabulary and to adopt whatever it is. There are things that could be done. It wouldn't be that difficult, that complicated. We already have a children's book industry. Is there a hurrah from the Rebbe that we should be printing books for our kids? The Rebbe doesn't get into these micro resolutions, but a parent that wants their kids to be educated Jewishly understands that you need to have a rich library for and obviously the Rebbe did do a version of that with Marcus in the early years and reprinting Marcus Lehman and all these things, which is conveying that idea that children need to have a rich Jewish environment. They need to be stimulated in a Jewish way. And the updated version of that for our generation might be, whether it's in Yiddish, whether it's in judeo-English, whether it's just in proper English, there are things that could be done to enrich our children's lives. I think that summarizes all the things that I had to say. And if I missed something, I think it's tough luck.
Yeah. Anyway, now I need to find the time to go and listen to that podcast. So I'm retroactively
after all that, I think I gave them a lot of credit, and like I said, I think they enriched the conversation. But I think hopefully this conversation was a bit more masuder, gave more historical perspective, and at least towards the end, there's more room for you have to have your own, be able to formulate your own opinion. Like I said at the beginning, if you have a two-dimensional, you're gluing minus together. So first of all, someone else will come and say you glued them together incorrectly, and if you rearrange them the other way, then they say something else. But it's not really about how you glue them together. You have to have your own, and I believe this in many other areas as well. You can't just not have your own opinion, your own. You have to have a mahalach of your own. Obviously, not to override and just replace what the Rebbe said. But there is a level where the Rebbe says, talk to the Rav, talk to Mashpia. The ideal Rav and the ideal Mashpia has enough of an independent thought process where they have an idea, a conception, and they can think largely. They can think about a community's direction. They can think about these larger questions, not just zooming in on a micro question. So that's my contribution and my effort to try to do a version of that. And obviously, it's up to others to decide whether they agree or what they disagree on. And of course, we welcome all feedback. And if someone made it all the way to the end, and I forgot to mention, please like and share, etc. And drop a comment and mention that you got all the way to the end, and we'll give you a like in response. Shkayach.
To be continued. All right, thank you, Mensch.
Yeah, you too.